In the year 1849, a British archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard was digging beneath a hill in northern Iraq called Kuyunjik. He was looking for the remains of ancient Nineveh. What he found was a room, a small chamber buried under 26 centuries of sand and forgotten kingdoms. Inside that chamber, stacked from floor to ceiling in careful order, were roughly 30,000 clay tablets. The library of a king named Ashurbanipal, who had ruled the Assyrian Empire more than 2,500 years earlier. And when scholars finally began translating those tablets, they discovered something that has been quietly disturbing historians ever since. Because most of those tablets were not Assyrian. They were copies. Careful, obsessive copies of much older texts. Texts written by a civilization that had lived and died and been forgotten more than 1,000 years before Ashurbanipal was even born. A civilization called Sumer. And in those texts, in the clay of a people who invented writing itself, there was a story about the earth, a story that did not begin with humans, a story that did not begin with animals, a story that did not even begin with the planet in the form we know it now. It began with a decision made somewhere else, by someone else, for a purpose that had nothing at all to do with us. According to the Sumerians, the earth had a job before we did. 10 of them, actually. 10 specific, cataloged, deliberately assigned functions that this planet was designed and prepared and calibrated to perform, long before the first human being ever stood upright on its surface. And when you read the tablets carefully, when you set aside the assumption that this must all be myth and metaphor and just look at what the words say, a very uncomfortable pattern begins to appear. The earth in the Sumerian record is not a wild place. It is not a garden that grew on its own. It is not a random accident of cosmic chemistry. It is a facility, a carefully built, carefully staffed, carefully monitored installation, and every one of those 10 functions is still, in one form or another, running underneath our feet right now. Most of what you were taught about the origin of civilization begins with the Sumerians and then stops there, as if they simply appeared on the plains of southern Mesopotamia around 3,500 years before Christ, invented the wheel, the plow, the calendar, the 60-minute hour, the 360-degree circle, mathematics, astronomy, law codes, kingship, and writing itself, all within a few generations, and then handed the toolkit of human civilization to everyone who came after. That is what the textbooks say. What the textbooks do not say is that the Sumerians themselves did not take credit for any of it. They insisted, in tablet after tablet, that they had been given these things, that the knowledge had come down from somewhere else, that before Sumer, before humans of any kind, there had been another operation running on this planet entirely, and the earth we live on now is what remains of it. This is the story the tablets tell, not the fragments you have heard. The whole thing, 10 functions, 10 purposes, 10 reasons this planet exists in the shape and orbit and chemistry it now has. And by the end of this, you will understand why every one of them matters, and why the people who first wrote them down did so with the kind of urgency you only find in a species that has been warned. Quick pause. Something new. For the first time since the 12 codes, there is a second document. It is called the 7 Resets. Every time the world was erased, matched against the 10 original functions of Earth, and the checklist of signs for the 8th. 4 are already active. Linked below, QR on screen. Back to the video. To understand what the tablets say about the Earth, you first have to understand who the Sumerians said built it. And this is where the modern reader tends to freeze, because the answer sounds ridiculous on first hearing. The Sumerians said that a group of beings called the Anunnaki came down from the sky and took charge of this world. The word itself, Anunnaki, is usually translated as those who from heaven to earth came. And in the tablets, these beings are not gods in the vague, misty sense that the word usually implies. They are specific individuals. They have names, they have functions, they have offices. They argue with each other, they keep records, they convene councils and they lose their tempers and they make bad decisions and try to correct them. They behave, in short, exactly the way a leadership class of physical beings would behave if they had been assigned to administer a project on a foreign world. The chief among them, in the earliest strata of the texts, is a figure called Anu. He is the Sky Lord, the ultimate authority, and he does not live on Earth. He lives somewhere else, somewhere the tablets call the heavenly abode, and he comes and goes. Below him are 2 half-brothers, both his sons, and their rivalry runs through the entire mythology of the ancient Near East. Their names are Enlil and Enki. Enlil is the enforcer, the administrator, the one who runs the surface, Enki is the scientist, the engineer, the one who understands the deep waters and the biology and the writing of what the tablets call the destinies. Beneath them is a whole administrative structure. Ninhursag, the birth goddess, the geneticist; Nanar, the moon watcher; Utu, later called Shamash, the sun. And below them all, a class of workers called the Igigi, who do the labor while the higher ranks give the orders. This is not a pantheon. This is a chain of command. And when the tablets describe the arrival of these beings, they do not describe a spiritual event. They describe a landing. They describe descent. They describe a place where the ships came down, which the tablets call a Duranki, a bond between heaven and earth. A landing platform. They describe the Anunnaki disembarking, surveying the terrain, and beginning work. And the work they began was not the creation of the planet. The planet, according to the tablets, was already there. What the Anunnaki did was assess it, modify it, and put it into service. The earth was not made for humans. It was inherited by them. This is the frame you need to hold in your mind for everything that follows. The tablets are not describing the birth of a world. They are describing the requisition of one. The Sumerians believed, and recorded very clearly, that this planet was scouted, catalogued, claimed, and assigned a purpose before a single member of our species existed. And that purpose was not singular. It was multiple. 10 distinct operational functions, each one interlocking with the others, each one still detectable in the physical record if you know what to look for. Some of them are obvious once they are named. Others are so strange that they were dismissed as poetry by the first scholars who read them. And only in the last few decades have geologists and biologists and astronomers begun, quietly, to notice that the poetry lines up with the data. Let us begin with the first one, because if the tablets are to be believed, the entire reason the Anunnaki came here in the first place, the entire reason this whole operation was set up, was to do one specific job. And it had nothing to do with life. It had nothing to do with the biosphere. It had nothing to do with any of the reasons a modern person would think a civilization might travel between the stars. They came here for the metal. Function number 1, in the Sumerian record, was extraction. The earth was designated as a refinery. Specifically, and the tablets are very specific about this, it was designated as a source of gold. Not gold as ornament, not gold as currency. Gold is a raw industrial input for a process happening somewhere else entirely, on a world that needed the metal for reasons of survival. And every other function of this planet, every subsequent operation the Anunnaki established here, flowed downstream from that first decision. The story of the extraction begins, in the tablets, with a crisis. The Anunnaki homeworld, which the Sumerians called Nibiru, was in trouble. Its atmosphere was thinning. Whatever process had once kept the planet warm and habitable was failing. And the solution, according to the priests who scanned the sky and read the destinies, was to seed the upper atmosphere with a fine suspension of gold particles, a shield, a reflective layer that would trap heat and buy time. The problem was that Nibiru did not have enough gold of its own to accomplish this. And so a decision was made, in the highest councils of that far-off world, to send an expedition to the one place in the local star system where the metal was known to exist in usable quantity. That place was Earth. The first team came down, according to the tablets, at a site the Sumerians called Rai, D-U. It is a real place. Archaeologists have excavated its ruins in southern Iraq. In the ordinary version of history, Eridu is simply the oldest known city in Mesopotamia, dating to roughly 5,000 years before Christ. In the Sumerian version of history, Eridu is much older than that. In their own records, Eridu was the first settlement of the Anunnaki on this planet. The name itself, they said, meant the home built far away, and the person who commanded that first base was Enki, the engineer, the one whose task was to determine whether the operation could actually work. He came down, the tablets say, in a craft that landed in the marshes at the head of the Persian Gulf. He brought a small team. He surveyed the local terrain. He tasted the waters. He assessed the mineral content of the soil and the rocks, and he sent his reports back to Anu on the homeworld. And the reports were promising. The gold was there. It was there in vast quantity. It was there in forms that could be processed. And so a much larger operation was authorized, and a second wave arrived, and the Anunnaki began, in earnest, to strip this planet of the metal they had come for. The mining did not happen in Mesopotamia. The tablets are very clear about this too. The mines were far away, in a land the Sumerians called Ab-Zu, which literally meant the primordial source. the deep place, the region from which the metal was drawn. In the geography of the Sumerian world, Ab, Zu, lay to the south, across water, in a great continent whose position and description match, with unsettling accuracy, the southern half of Africa. And when you look at where the earliest known gold mines in human history are located, you find them in exactly that region. In what is now Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and South Africa, there are workings so old that no one has ever been able to date them with certainty. Some of them show evidence of extraction predating any known human industrial capability by tens of thousands of years. Anglo-American Corporation, one of the largest mining conglomerates on the continent, published a report in the 1970s, acknowledging that when their geologists went looking for new gold deposits, the most reliable method they had was to find the old ones. To find the shafts and pits and tailings piles left by some earlier operation whose age they could not determine and whose operators they could not name. The gold was where somebody had already been digging for it. And whoever that somebody was, they had been extremely thorough. The Sumerian Tablets say the somebody was the Anunnaki, and they say the operation ran for a very long time, for thousands of years, if the tablets are read literally, and possibly for hundreds of thousands. The workers were, at first, the Anunnaki themselves, the lower-ranking members of the expedition, the Igigi, but the labor was brutal, and the mines were deep, and the conditions eventually broke the workforce. The tablets describe a mutiny, a specific event at a specific location where the Igigi laid down their tools and refused to continue. They burned their equipment. They marched on the administrative center where the senior Anunnaki lived, and they demanded relief. And the response to that mutiny, according to the tablets, was the second function of this planet, which was to produce something, or rather, someone, to provide a new class of workers who could take over the labor and allow the operation to continue. But before we get to that, let us stay with the mining a little longer. Because what the tablets describe about the extraction process itself is where the story starts to become physically very difficult to dismiss. The Sumerians described a facility they called the Ekur, which meant the mountain house, a place where the raw ore was brought after being taken from the ground. It was not in Africa. It was in the Nile Valley. And its function, they said, was to process the metal into a form that could be transported off-world. The Ekur was a refinery, and its most striking architectural feature, according to the descriptions that survive, was a pair of vast stone structures aligned to specific celestial bearings, designed to serve some function connected to the arrivals and departures of the ships that carried the processed gold home. You know what those structures were. Everyone does. They are still there. They sit on the Giza Plateau, on the west bank of the Nile, and they have stood in silence for a length of time that mainstream Egyptology cannot fully account for. The Great Pyramid and its neighbor were, in the Sumerian version of events, built by the Anunnaki as part of the extraction operation. Their true function was industrial. The mystical interpretations that grew up around them in later Egyptian religion, the tomb theory, the pharaonic cult, all of that came thousands of years later after the original operators had left and only the empty structures remained. When the Egyptians of the dynastic period tried to explain the pyramids, they were guessing. When the Sumerians described them, they were remembering. And the memory is very specific. The tablets describe the Ekur as a place where processed metal was stored, weighed, and prepared for lifting. They describe a chamber in the interior of the structure, deep in the stone, where the final assay was performed. They describe rooms above it where the material was staged. They describe a network of shafts, oriented to particular stars, whose purpose was tied to the timing of the operation and to communication with the personnel on the homeworld. And they describe, most extraordinarily of all, the moment when the operation ended. When the final shipment was made, when the last of the workers were called back to their ships, and the Ekur was sealed, and the plateau was abandoned, and the whole enormous facility was left standing empty, waiting for whoever might come after to make sense of it. The people who came after were us, and we have been trying to make sense of it, unsuccessfully, for 4,000 years. If the tablets are correct, if the first and driving function of this planet was to serve as a gold mine for a foreign civilization, then almost everything about the geological accident that is Earth begins to look less accidental. The tablets do not describe the Anunnaki creating the planet, but they do describe the Anunnaki noticing the planet, recognizing what was in it, coming a very long way to get it. And the question of why this particular planet, in this particular star system, has an unusually rich concentration of heavy metals in its crust is a question that mainstream geology has never fully answered. The The standard explanation is the late heavy bombardment, a period roughly 4 billion years ago, when a rain of metal-rich asteroids is thought to have delivered the gold and platinum group elements that are now found in the outer layers of the Earth. Fine, but that only pushes the question back. Why here? Why in this quantity? Why in forms and depths that turn out to be, when you look at the earliest human civilizations, exactly the ones that were mined first and most heavily by whoever was here before us? The Sumerians had an answer, and their answer was extraction. The Earth was chosen. It was chosen because it had the metal. And every subsequent purpose it was made to serve, the biosphere, the workforce, the calendars, the councils, the sacred sites, all of it grew out of that first industrial decision. This planet is, at its foundational function, according to the tablets, a mine. Everything else was built around that. And there is a detail here that most people who tell this story leave out. The tablets do not simply say the Anunnaki took gold from the Earth. They say the Anunnaki took gold from the Earth using techniques we cannot fully reconstruct. There are passages that describe the melting of stone. There are passages that describe the moving of vast quantities of rock without visible tools. There are passages that describe the sifting of powder from stream beds and the collection of dust from the walls of shafts driven so deep that the temperature at the working face rose to a level a human being could not survive. And there are passages that describe what was done with the gold after it had been extracted. It was not, according to the Sumerians, hoarded. It was not stored on Earth. It was launched, lifted, in the words of the tablets, to the heavenly abode. And this is where the priests of the operation, the record keepers, the ones who wrote down what they were witnessing, began to use language that would later be interpreted as mythical because there was no other framework in which to place it. They described ships that could carry the metal upward. They described a schedule of arrivals and departures tied to the movements of specific celestial bodies. They described the crossing of what they called the Great Above, the passage between the local world and the far one where the metal was needed. And they described the specific ceremony that was performed when a load was ready to depart, in which offerings were made and calculations were checked, and the ship, whatever it was, rose from the platform and disappeared. This is not the language of religion inventing itself. This is the language of a species watching a logistics operation that it does not understand and doing its best to make a record of what it is seeing. Now, if you are a modern reader, there is an obvious question to ask at this point, and it is a fair one. Why would beings capable of interstellar travel, capable of atmospheric engineering, capable of biological manipulation on a planetary scale, need to travel enormous distances to obtain a specific chemical element? Could they not have synthesized it? Could they not have found it closer to home? And the answer that emerges from a close reading of the tablets, and from a certain amount of physics, is that gold is genuinely difficult to make. It requires stellar processes. It requires supernova events, or the collision of neutron stars, or the older, slower nucleosynthesis processes inside dying giants. You cannot manufacture it in a laboratory in useful quantity. You have to find it where nature has already made it. And in the local corner of the galaxy that the Anunnaki appear to have been operating in, the tablets suggest that Earth was, quite simply, the deposit with the highest yield. This is why, according to the Sumerians, they came here. Not for the beauty, not for the biosphere, not for the eventual creatures who would evolve on this world and take over its surface after they left. They came for the metal. Everything else was consequence. And the first great consequence, the one that reshaped this planet in ways still visible from orbit, was the creation of the labor force. Because the Anunnaki, after generations of mining, decided they were tired of digging. And so they built something to dig for them. That something was us. And the story of how we came to exist, in the Sumerian version of events, is not a story of gradual biological evolution. It is a story of design, of intent, of a laboratory being built, a specimen being selected, and a deliberate act of engineering being performed on the flesh of an existing creature to produce a new one. Which brings us to function number 2. The second function of the Earth, according to the tablets, was to serve as a biological laboratory, and what was manufactured in that laboratory was the human being. This is where the Sumerian record enters territory that most modern readers find genuinely difficult, not because the technology described is impossible, but because it is uncomfortably plausible. The tablets do not describe the creation of humanity as a miracle. They describe it as a procedure. There are steps, there are personnel, there are failures, there are revisions, there are formal reports back to the administrative council when a run of specimens does not meet specification, and there are celebrations when a batch finally does. What the Sumerians preserved, in careful cuneiform, is the working notebook of a genetic engineering program. And the product of that program was walking upright on this planet within a few generations of the moment the first successful specimen was decanted from its vessel. The story begins with the mutiny. The Igigi, exhausted from centuries of mining, refused to continue. The tablets describe a specific evening when the workers gathered outside the residence of Enlil, the administrator, and burned their tools in a great fire. When Enlil came out to demand an explanation, they told him plainly that the labor was killing them, that the shafts were too deep, that the ore was too hard, and that they would rather face the consequences of insubordination than descend into the mines one more day. Enlil, according to the tablets, was furious. He called for the council. He proposed severe measures. He wanted the ringleaders identified and punished. And it was at this council, in front of Anu himself, who had come down from the homeworld to adjudicate the crisis, that Enki spoke up with a different proposal. Not punishment, replacement. Let a new class of worker be made. Let the Igigi be relieved. Let the operation continue with a labor force that could be manufactured to specification. Anu, according to the tablets, was skeptical. He asked what Enki had in mind, and Enki explained that there was, already present on this planet, a creature that could serve as the base stock for what he intended to build, a creature that walked upright, a creature that had hands capable of grasping, a creature that was, in his words, close to us in shape but far below us in mind. What he proposed was to take a specimen of this creature and modify it, to add what was needed, to upgrade it into a form that could understand instructions, operate tools, live in barracks, and reproduce enough of itself to maintain the workforce indefinitely. Anu, after considerable debate, authorized the experiment, and the laboratory in which it would be conducted was placed under the joint supervision of Enki and his half-sister Ninhursag, whom the tablets identify as the mistress of birth, the one whose specialty was living tissue and the shaping of it. The location of the laboratory is named in the tablets. It was called the Bit Shimti, which meant the house of that which is breathed in, the house of the breath of life. And it was located, the texts say, in a region called the Abzu, near the mines themselves, at a site where a specific plant grew that Enki required for his work. The setting matters, because the tablets specify that the raw genetic material for the new creature was to be drawn from two sources. One was the base creature, the upright walker who was already present on the planet. The other was the Anunnaki themselves, their own tissue, their own blood, in the language of the tablets. And these two components were to be combined in a specific ratio, in a specific vessel, using a specific procedure that Enki had developed after what the tablets suggest were many failed attempts. Modern readers will notice, at this point, that what is being described is a form of genetic engineering, the taking of DNA from one organism, its combination with material from another, and the introduction of the combined genome into a host organism for gestation. In the tablets, the host was not the vessel itself. The vessel was, in the language of the priests, a kind of chamber in which the initial combining was performed. But the actual gestation, the growing of the new creature, required a womb. And the womb was provided, the tablets say, by a group of female Anunnaki, 7 of them, who volunteered for the role. Their names are preserved. They are called, collectively, the birth goddesses. And their function in the operation was to carry the modified embryos to term, to deliver them, and then to hand them over to the nursery where the young of the new species would be raised, taught, and eventually deployed to the mines. The first attempts did not go well. The tablets are explicit about this. Some of the early specimens were malformed. Some could not walk, some could not see. Some had proportions that made them useless for labor. There is a passage in one text where Enki and Ninhursag review the results of a particular run, and both of them describe, in language that reads like a laboratory report, the specific failures of specific specimens. And there is another passage, more famous, in which Ninhursag becomes frustrated with a run of poor results and offers a challenge to Enki. She will make a specimen so unusual, she says, so far from the intended specification, that even he will not be able to find a productive use for it. And she does. She produces a creature with severe deformities. And Enki, taking up the challenge, finds a role for even this one. The exchange is written like the record of 2 engineers arguing about tolerances on a production line. Eventually, after many iterations, they succeed. The tablets describe the moment of the first fully successful specimen with the kind of ceremonial language that suggests the operation had been running for a very long time and the personnel involved had begun to lose hope. When the specimen was born, when it was found to be viable, when it was verified to have the capacity for language and instruction, there was a celebration. Anu was informed, the council was reconvened, and the new creature was given a name. In the tablets, that name is Lulu. It means, in the Sumerian, the mixed one, the blended one, the primitive worker. And this is the creature that, in the Sumerian version of the human story, is the ancestor of every one of us. Now, the temptation for a modern reader is to dismiss all of this as a myth of anthropogenesis, one among many that ancient civilizations produced to explain their own origins. Every culture has a creation story. The Sumerians had this one. Why treat it differently? The answer is that the Sumerian version is unlike any of the others in one specific respect. It is procedural. It has stages. It has personnel with specific roles. It has specific quantities of specific inputs. It describes iteration and failure and revision. It does not read like the sudden appearance of a species out of divine will. It reads like the notes from a project that took a very long time and required a great deal of trial and error. And when you compare this account to what modern genetics is beginning to say about the sudden and unexplained emergence of certain uniquely human traits, particularly the traits associated with language and abstract cognition, the comparison becomes difficult to look away from. The gene most closely associated with the human capacity for speech is called FOXP2. It is a small gene, but it makes a large difference. Humans who are born with mutations in FOXP2 have severe speech and language impairments. The version of FOXP2 found in modern humans differs from the version found in chimpanzees in two specific positions on the protein. Just two. But those two changes appear to be crucial. And the current best estimate of when those changes entered the human lineage is somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago. Which is to say, they appeared quite recently. They appeared much more recently than the split between humans and other apes. And their appearance coincides uncomfortably closely with the emergence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens in the fossil record. The Sumerian tablets do not, of course, use the word gene. They do not use the word protein. They do not describe the specific molecular biology of what was done in the bit Shimti. What they describe is the addition of something to a base creature that transformed it. They describe the specific capacity that was added, which was the capacity for language, for instruction, for the receiving and executing of commands. And they describe the moment at which this capacity was verified as present in the offspring. If a person reading the tablets in the 19th century had tried to translate what was being described into the language of contemporary science, they could not have done it, because the science did not yet exist. Now it does. And a growing number of researchers, cautiously and quietly, have begun to notice that the Sumerian account of what happened to us is not obviously wrong. The tablets go on. They describe not just the creation of the first specimen, but the establishment of a population. The first Lulu were, according to the account, sterile. They could work, but they could not reproduce. And so each new worker had to be produced individually in the laboratory, gestated by one of the birth goddesses, and raised by hand. This was, obviously, inefficient. The Anunnaki wanted a self-replicating labor force, and so a further modification was performed. Additional genetic material was added. The reproductive systems of the new creature were reworked, and after another period of iteration and failure, a fully reproductive population was achieved. The tablets mark this second breakthrough with as much ceremony as the first. The new humans could now, in the language of the record, be as the birds of the sky and the fish of the sea. They could multiply. They could sustain their own numbers without further intervention from the laboratory. And once this had been verified, the deployment began. Cohorts of the new humans were sent, in caravans, from the Abzu to the mines. They were housed in barracks. They were fed. They were instructed in the tasks they were expected to perform. And the tablets record, with a certain grim satisfaction from Enlil, that within a very short time the productivity of the mines had returned to previous levels. The Igigi were released from the surface labor. The Anunnaki returned to their administrative work. And the humans, the Lulu, the newly manufactured biological asset of the operation, went into the shafts and dug the gold that had originally motivated the whole expedition. This is, according to the tablets, why we exist. Not as the crown of creation, not as the image of a benevolent God, but as tool users, made to use tools on behalf of somebody else. There is something worth pausing on here, because this is where the emotional weight of the Sumerian story begins to become distinct from the emotional weight of most ancient origin myths. In the tablets, the creation of the human being is not a gift. It is not an act of love. It is a solution to a labor problem. And the Anunnaki, in the immediate aftermath of the creation, are not depicted as parents. They are depicted as managers. When they are pleased, it is because production is going well. When they are displeased, it is because the workforce has become inconvenient. The tablets record hundreds of years later in the internal chronology of the story, a moment when Enlil becomes so annoyed with the multiplying humans, with their noise and their disorder and their reproductive success, that he proposes to have them wiped out. The proposal is serious, it is debated, and it is eventually adopted. What follows is the flood, but we will come to the flood in its proper place, because it belongs to a different function of the planet than the one we are examining now. The point for the moment is that the second function of Earth was, according to the tablets, the manufacture of a species. Us. A species designed for a specific purpose. A species built to specification. A species whose entire biological existence was, in the original plan, subordinate to the industrial requirements of an operation being run by someone else. And every one of us, according to this account, still carries in our cells the record of what was done. The specific ratio of base creature to Anunnaki that was combined in the vessels of the Bit Shimti. The specific adjustments that were made to the reproductive system. The specific insertions that gave us language and instruction and the capacity to be told what to do. All of it, if the tablets are correct, is written in our own DNA. And when the geneticists say that our genome contains segments whose origin they cannot fully account for, when they say that there are stretches of code in every human being that do not correspond to any known evolutionary process on this planet, when they raise the possibility, however carefully and however hedged, that certain features of our biology look introduced rather than developed, they are saying, in the language of their own field, something that the Sumerians said in cuneiform 4,000 years ago, which is that we were made, and that the making of us was the second great purpose this planet was assigned to serve. The workforce, once created and deployed, ran the mines for a long time. The gold went up. The Anunnaki grew rich in the terms of their own economy. And Earth, for a long stretch of what the tablets present as a very long history, functioned as a two-purpose facility. It was a mine, and it was a hatchery. Every other function that we will come to, every other role this planet was made to play, was added on top of those first two. But there was a third function, and it was one that emerged not by design, but by consequence. Because when you place a population of manufactured beings on a planet that also contains a landing platform for craft coming from far away, and you allow those beings to observe the sky and to notice the pattern of arrivals and departures, you accidentally create something else. You create witnesses. You create record keepers. You create, in short, the beginning of astronomy. And the tablets are clear that this was not part of the original plan. It was a byproduct. But it became, in the end, one of the most important things that has ever happened on this world. Function number 3, according to the Sumerian record, was calibration. The Earth was designated as a station from which the movements of the local stellar neighborhood could be measured, cataloged, and used as a reference frame for a very specific ongoing calculation. And the calculation in question had to do with the arrival of the ships. Because if you are running a mining operation on a foreign planet, and your transport vessels are being sent from a distant homeworld to pick up finished cargo on a regular schedule, you need to know, with great precision, when they are going to appear. You need to know where in the sky to look for them. You need to know when to have the cargo ready and when to have the platform cleared. And to do any of that, you need to establish, on the surface of Earth, a permanent astronomical reference system, which is what the Anunnaki did. The tablets describe this system in remarkable detail. They describe the division of the visible sky into 3 great bands, each one assigned to a particular member of the leadership. The northern band belonged to Enlil, the southern band belonged to Enki. The central band, the one through which the sun, the moon, and the visible planets moved, belonged to Anu. This division was not decorative, it was functional. Each band contained a set of specific constellations, and each constellation had a name, and each name corresponded to a specific point of reference by which the movement of the great objects overhead could be tracked. The Sumerians did not invent this system on their own, in the way that later cultures like the Greeks invented their own constellations by drawing pictures in the stars. The Sumerians received the system, complete and calibrated, from the Anunnaki themselves. It was, in the language of the tablets, given down. It was a working tool of the operation. And it was passed on to the humans because the humans, once they had been created, were the ones who would be doing the actual watching. If you think about that for a moment, it explains something that has puzzled historians of science for a very long time. Sumerian astronomy, when it first appears in the archaeological record, is not primitive. It is not a starting point. It is not the fumbling early attempts of a young civilization trying to work out the patterns in the sky. It is a mature, complete, mathematically sophisticated system. It uses a base 60 numerical framework that we still use today, for our clocks and for our maps. It divides the circle into 360 degrees. It knows about precession. It knows about the axial tilt of the Earth. It knows about the periodicity of the visible planets. It even, in some of the oldest tablets, appears to know about planets that were not confirmed by modern astronomy until the invention of the telescope. And this raises a very obvious question. Where did all of this come from? The mainstream answer is that it came from centuries of patient observation. The Sumerians, we are told, watched the sky carefully for generations, wrote down what they saw, refined their models, and eventually produced the sophisticated system that we now find in the tablets. This is a plausible explanation, up to a point. It is the way most sciences develop. But there is a problem with it, in the Sumerian case, and the problem is one of timescale. The system that appears in the tablets is fully mature at the very earliest strata of the record. There is no gradual development visible in the archaeological sequence. There is no crude version followed by a refined version. There is only the finished product, present from the beginning, and passed forward with minor variations for the next 3,000 years. This is not what science looks like when it develops naturally. This is what a system looks like when it is inherited. The Sumerians said it was inherited. They said it came from the Anunnaki. And when you read the tablets that describe the specific calibration procedures, when you read the ones that describe how observations were to be made, when you read the ones that describe the specific reference points that were to be used to establish the position of a given object in the sky, you begin to understand what the system was actually for. It was not for agriculture. It was not for religion. It was not for the timing of planting or the celebration of festivals, although it was eventually used for all of those purposes. Its original function, according to the tablets, was to track a single, very specific object, an object that the Sumerians called Nibiru, an object whose orbit was so long, so eccentric, that it appeared in the local sky only rarely, and whose arrivals and departures were the thing that most needed to be known in advance if the operation was to run smoothly. Nibiru is, in the Sumerian cosmology, the homeworld of the Anunnaki. It is described as a planet on a highly elongated orbit that carries it far out into the darkness and then brings it back, once every 3,600 years or so, into the inner region of the solar system, where it becomes visible from Earth. When Nibiru appears, the Sumerians said, the Anunnaki come. They come in ships. They come in fleets. They come to collect what has been extracted, to deliver personnel, to conduct inspections, and to return home. And between arrivals, during the long period when Nibiru is far away and cannot be seen, the operation on Earth continues under the supervision of whatever personnel have been left in place. This is the system the tablets describe. And the astronomical function of the Earth, in this system, was to be the platform from which the timing of the next arrival was constantly and precisely calculated. Now, whether or not you accept the specific claim about Nibiru, and it is a claim that mainstream astronomy does not accept, the fact remains that the astronomical system left to us by the Sumerians is, functionally, an interstellar tracking system. It is designed to locate specific objects against a fixed grid of reference stars. It is designed to predict the future position of those objects with great accuracy over long periods of time. It is designed, in short, for a task that a strictly earthbound agricultural civilization did not have. The Sumerians had this system anyway. They used it, later, for their own purposes. But its original purpose, according to their own record, was to serve the operational needs of a spacefaring civilization that came from elsewhere and needed to know, at all times, exactly when its next transport was going to arrive. The specific tools of this astronomical function are still with us. The 360-degree circle is with us. The 60-minute hour is with us. The 12-month year is with us, although the specific number of months and the specific length of each one has been adjusted over the millennia. The zodiac is with us. It was not invented by the Greeks. It was received by the Greeks from the Babylonians, who received it from the Sumerians, who received it, according to their own record, from the Anunnaki. The 12 signs of the zodiac correspond to the 12 constellations that lie along the path the sun appears to trace across the sky during the course of a year. The path itself, the ecliptic, is not a real object. It is a projection of the plane of the Earth's orbit onto the celestial sphere. To notice that projection, you have to already understand that the Earth is orbiting the Sun. And the Sumerians appear to have understood this, or at least to have inherited the understanding, thousands of years before it was independently rediscovered by human science. There is a tablet, held in the collection of the State Museum in Berlin, catalogued as VAT number 979, which shows an object that has puzzled cuneiform scholars since it was first translated. The tablet depicts what appears to be a schematic of the solar system. It shows the Sun at the center. It shows a series of planets in orbit around it. It shows their relative sizes and their relative distances, in a way that is not fully accurate by modern measurements, but is much more accurate than any diagram produced by any other ancient culture. And it shows something else. It shows an additional body, larger than the Earth, on a path that carries it in from beyond the visible planets, past the Sun, and back out again. The Sumerians labeled this body. They called it Nibiru. The mainstream interpretation of the tablet is that the depiction is symbolic, or that the additional body is a comet, or that the whole thing is a misreading of the original by later copyists. But the tablet exists, and what it shows, if it is read at face value, is a system that the Sumerians should not have been able to draw with the level of detail they drew it. The astronomical function of Earth, in the Sumerian view, was not passive. It was active. It required observers on the ground. It required record keepers. It required the maintenance of a specific set of observational stations, some of which the tablets name and describe. And these stations, again, are not fully explainable by mainstream archaeology. There are stone alignments at Nabta Playa in the western desert of Egypt that predate the pyramids by thousands of years and appear to encode astronomical information of significant precision. There are megalithic sites in Malta, on Sardinia, in Portugal, in Ireland, in Scotland, in Turkey, and in Peru, all of them oriented to specific solar and stellar events, all of them constructed with a level of engineering knowledge that the accepted historical narrative does not fully explain. Someone was watching the sky, systematically and carefully, at a time when the accepted timeline says nobody was watching anything. The Sumerians said the Anunnaki were watching, and that they set up their humans to watch on their behalf, and that the whole infrastructure of ancient astronomical observation is what remains of that system. And there is a further point. The Anunnaki, according to the tablets, did not merely observe. They calculated. They performed, on the Earth, mathematical operations of a kind that require both a sophisticated numerical system and a great deal of accumulated data. The base 60 number system that they used, and that they left to us, is unusually well suited to certain kinds of astronomical calculation. It divides evenly into more integer factors than the base 10 system does. It makes fractions cleaner. It makes ratios easier to manipulate. It is, in other words, an engineer's number system, chosen for its utility rather than for its convenience in counting on the fingers of two hands. And when the Babylonians, thousands of years later, produced tables of planetary positions that turn out, on modern analysis, to be accurate to within a fraction of a degree over periods of centuries, they were using the tools that the Sumerians had inherited from the Anunnaki. Tools built for a task that no purely human civilization of the 3rd millennium before Christ should have needed. If the tablets are correct, then the astronomical knowledge that we now use, the calendars and clocks and coordinates and orbits, all descend from a system that was originally built to serve the arrival schedule of an off-world logistics chain. And every time you look at your watch, every time you consult a compass bearing, every time you glance at the arrangement of the stars overhead and recognize a constellation by name, you are using the residue of an operation whose original purpose had nothing to do with you. This is what the Sumerians said. And it is what the tablets, in their calm and matter-of-fact way, continue to say to anyone who will read them. But calibration was not the only function that was added, as the operation matured to the mining and the manufacture that had come first. Because if you have a workforce on a foreign world, and you have supply ships arriving on a regular schedule, and you have astronomical stations tracking the movements of the stars, you also need somewhere for the personnel to live. Somewhere for the visiting dignitaries to stay when they come down from the ships. Somewhere for the leadership to conduct business when they are not directly overseeing the mines. And so the Anunnaki, according to the tablets, established on the Earth a fourth function. They built a residence. They built, in fact, several residences. They built cities. And the cities they built, and the way in which those cities were arranged, and the specific purposes to which they were put, constitute one of the most extraordinary and least known parts of the whole Sumerian record. Because these cities are still there. Some of them are in ruins. Some of them are still lived in. And every one of them was built, according to the Sumerians, not by human hands, but by the Anunnaki themselves, before humans existed to build anything at all. The fourth function of Earth, in the Sumerian record, was residence, the building of cities. And what makes this claim particularly interesting is that the Sumerians did not, in their own account, take credit for the cities. They insisted that the cities predated them, that the settlements from which their own civilization eventually grew had been laid out, built, and inhabited long before any human being had done any work of any kind. And the specific cities they named, the ones they said were the original establishments of the Anunnaki, are the same cities whose ruins archaeologists have been excavating in Iraq for the last 170 years. There were, according to the tablets, 7 original cities. The Sumerians called them the 7 first cities. Each one had a name. Each one had a founding lord, one of the senior Anunnaki, whose personal residence and administrative headquarters it was. And each one was assigned a specific function within the overall operation. Eridu was the first. It belonged to Enki. It was the coastal base, the landing platform, the point of arrival for personnel and equipment coming down from the ships. Bad Tabira came next, and it belonged to a figure called Nergal in some versions of the account. Its function was metallurgical. It was where the raw ore, once it had been assessed and prepared, was transformed into worked metal. Larak followed, and it was a communications station of some kind, a place from which signals were sent and received. Sippar was the fourth, and its function is the most extraordinary of the 7. It was, according to the tablets, the spaceport, the specific site from which the shuttles ascended to rendezvous with the motherships in orbit. Its name, Sippar, meant the city of the birds, and the birds in question were not, in the original context, feathered animals. They were the craft that came and went from the platform there. Then came Shurapak, which was a medical center, a place where the biological work continued after the original creation of humanity had been completed, and where the ongoing genetic maintenance of the workforce was carried out. Then Nippur, which was the administrative capital, the seat of Enlil, the enforcer, the one who ran the surface. Nippur was not on the coast, it was inland. It was placed at what the tablets describe as the exact geographical center of the operation, so that Enlil could exercise authority equally over all of the outlying installations. And finally there was Lagash, the 7th, which was some kind of judicial or ceremonial center whose exact function is described in less detail than the others. The tablets sometimes list a slightly different set of 7, depending on the period from which the specific text derives, but the pattern is always the same. 7 cities, 7 functions, 7 Anunnaki lords, and a network of infrastructure connecting them that ran, in the description, for what would now be tens of thousands of years before any human city was ever built anywhere on Earth. The archaeological reality of these places is where the account gets very difficult to dismiss out of hand, because 5 of the 7 cities named in the Sumerian first city lists correspond to actual archaeological sites that have been excavated and dated. Eridu, Bad Tabira, Sippar, Shuruppak, and Nippur are all real places. Their ruins have been mapped. Their earliest levels have been carbon dated. And in every case, the earliest occupation layer at these sites goes back further than the accepted date for the emergence of the Sumerian civilization itself. There is something at each of these sites that is older than Sumer, something that the Sumerians inherited, moved into, and continued to use. What that older thing was, mainstream archaeology cannot fully explain. The Sumerians said it was the ruins of the Anunnaki cities that had come before them. And the layout of the sites, when examined carefully, tends to preserve certain features that are difficult to account for on the assumption of an ordinary human origin. At Eridu, for example, the earliest levels reveal a series of superimposed temples, each one built on top of the previous one, each one following the exact same orientation, each one preserving the exact same central plan. The persistence of this orientation across thousands of years of continuous rebuilding is striking. It suggests that the original layout of the site was regarded as sacred, as inviolable, as something that had been given down and could not be altered. And when you ask the Sumerians why this was so, they will tell you, in the surviving temple records, that the layout of Eridu was established by Enki himself in the earliest days of the operation, and that it corresponded to a specific set of astronomical alignments that had to be preserved if the site was to continue to function as intended. The temple at Eridu was not just a religious structure. It was, in the original design, a piece of infrastructure. It served a specific technical purpose within the larger network, and that purpose was preserved in a kind of cultural memory, even after the original operators had gone and only the empty structures remained. Sippar is another case worth examining. The site is located in the north of what is now Iraq, near the modern town of Abu Habba. It is, in the mainstream account, a Babylonian religious center dedicated to the sun god Shamash. But the site is old. Its earliest levels go back into the 4th millennium before Christ, and the Sumerian Tablets, which predate the Babylonian era by roughly 1,000 years, describe Sippar as a spaceport, as the location from which the shuttles rose, as a place with a specific piece of equipment installed at its center that the tablets call the Me. The Me was not a single object, it was a set, a collection of what the tablets describe as tablets of destiny, physical devices of some kind that governed the operation of the launch platform and without which the ships could not safely lift. There is a famous story preserved in a Sumerian epic in which a mythical bird, the Anzu, steals the Me from its resting place at Sippar and hides them in the mountains. The consequences are catastrophic. The launches cannot proceed. The operation grinds to a halt. And the story becomes, in essence, the account of the recovery of the stolen equipment and the resumption of normal function at the spaceport. If you read this story as a myth, it is charming but obscure. If you read it as a distorted memory of a real incident involving a real piece of industrial infrastructure at a real site, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a security breach report. It becomes the record of a moment when the operation of the spaceport was disrupted, when the equipment necessary for launches was taken by a hostile party, when the personnel had to organize a recovery mission, and when the equipment was eventually returned and the launches were resumed. The specific language of the story, the specific sequence of events, the specific concerns of the personnel involved, all of it fits the second reading much more comfortably than the first. And this pattern, of a story that reads like myth but decodes like incident report, runs through the whole Sumerian record. It is one of the reasons the tablets are so difficult to categorize. They do not fit any of the categories we would prefer to place them in. The 4 cities we have looked at so far are the coastal base at Eridu, the metallurgical center at Bad Tibira, the communications station at Larak, and the spaceport at Sippar. There is a specific pattern to how these are laid out on the ground. When you plot their locations on a map of southern Mesopotamia, they form a wedge, a specific geometric arrangement with the wedge pointing in a particular direction. The direction, when analyzed by a certain school of researchers, turns out to align with a specific approach path, a specific corridor along which vehicles descending from orbit would fly if they wanted to land at the platform at Sippar without disturbing the other installations along the way. Whether or not this analysis is correct, the fact that the cities lie in a specific geometric pattern is not disputed. The pattern is there, it is measurable, it exists in the ground, and it corresponds, remarkably closely, to what the tablets say was the operational logic of the network. Beyond these 4 coastal installations, there was the administrative capital at Nippur, and Nippur is where the Sumerian record becomes, in some respects, most detailed. Because Nippur was the seat of Enlil, it was the political center. It was the place from which the decisions that shaped the operation were made, and the tablets describe, in unusual detail, the specific building that stood at the heart of Nippur and served as Enlil's headquarters. It was called the Ekur, the mountain house, the same term that was used for the great processing facility in Egypt, though the 2 structures were very different in form and function. The Ekur at Nippur was, according to the tablets, a stepped tower of extraordinary height, level upon level, rising from the plain, each level dedicated to a specific function within Enlil's administration. At the top of the tower was a chamber that Enlil used for direct communication with the ships in orbit and with the homeworld beyond. The chamber contained instruments that the tablets refer to as the eyes and the ears of the sky. It was, in the language of a modern reader, a communications relay, a ground control station, a specific piece of infrastructure that connected the surface operation to the fleet. If this description sounds familiar, that is because it should. Every ziggurat in Mesopotamia, every stepped pyramid in Mesoamerica, every tiered temple in South and East Asia seems in some way to preserve the memory of this original tower at Nippur. The form of the building was repeated, over and over, across cultures that had no direct contact with one another, over a span of thousands of years. The specific proportions were adjusted, the specific materials changed, but the essential template, the tower with levels rising to a summit chamber, appears again and again wherever human civilization emerges. And in the accounts that survive from those cultures, From the Sumerians to the Babylonians to the Maya to the Egyptians of certain periods, the towers are described as places of contact. Places where the space between the earthly world and the sky world becomes thin. Places where the priests can communicate with beings who reside above. It is not difficult to see, in these descriptions, the persistence of a memory of what the original tower actually was. It was a communications station. It was where Enlil talked to Anu on the homeworld, and every later tower is a copy of that first one, built by humans who no longer remembered exactly what it had been for, but who preserved, in stone, the shape of the thing they had been told to preserve. Shurapak, the medical center, is another case where the Sumerian account and the archaeological record converge in interesting ways. The city is real. It has been excavated. It sits in modern Iraq, and its ruins have yielded a substantial cuneiform archive. But the Sumerians said that Shurapak was, in the earliest days of the operation, the place where the ongoing genetic work continued after the initial creation of the Lulu had been completed at the Abzu laboratory. The birth goddesses, according to the tablets, moved their operations to Shurapak after the manufacturing process had been standardized, and it was at Shurapak that the maintenance of the human population, its adjustment, its selective breeding, its continued modification, was performed. And it is at Shurapak, in one of the most extraordinary passages in the whole Sumerian corpus, that the story of the flood begins. We will come to the flood. It belongs to its own function, and it is far too large a subject to be dealt with in passing here. But it is worth noting, as we conclude our survey of the fourth function, that the Sumerian city network was not just infrastructure. It was, in the eyes of the people who inherited it, sacred. The 7 cities were remembered, in the temple traditions of every culture that grew up in the region, as the original seat of everything that mattered. The gods lived there. The tablets of destiny were kept there. The rites that maintained the order of the world were performed there. And when later Mesopotamian rulers, the kings of Akkad and Babylon and Assyria, wanted to legitimize their own authority, the standard method was to make a pilgrimage to the ruins of one of the 7 and claim that they had been received there by the ancient powers whose thrones the ruins represented. This was not a marketing exercise. It was a serious act of political theology. The 7 cities were the roots. Everything else was the tree. And the tree grew large. Because once the residential function of the planet had been established, once the cities were laid out and staffed and running, the Anunnaki began to expand their footprint on Earth in ways that go far beyond southern Mesopotamia. There is evidence in the tablets of installations in Egypt, in the Sinai, in the mountains of what is now Turkey, in the Indus Valley, and in what is now western Iran. Every one of these installations had a specific function within the overall network. And every one of them, in the Sumerian view, was linked back, through a chain of command and communication, to the administrative capital at Nippur and to the homeworld beyond. The Earth, for a long stretch of what the tablets present as its operational history, was a fully integrated node in a stellar civilization whose center of gravity was somewhere else entirely. We were, in the earliest phase of the story, a colony, a working colony, with cities, with administrators, with infrastructure, and with a role in a larger economic and technological system whose scale is difficult, at this remove, even to imagine. This brings us to the 5th function of Earth. Because a working colony, if it is to be maintained over long timescales, requires more than gold mines and workers in cities. It requires a living system. It requires a biosphere. It requires plants and animals, and the ecological webs that connect them, adjusted and stocked and managed in specific ways to serve the needs of the personnel who are stationed there. And the Sumerians said, in one of the most explicit passages in the whole record, that the biosphere of Earth was not a wild thing. It was a garden, a specific, cataloged, actively managed garden. And the garden had a name. It was called Eden. The 5th function of Earth, in the Sumerian record, was cultivation, the management of a living system, the deliberate stocking, adjustment, and maintenance of the biosphere for the benefit of the operation running on the surface. And the tablets are extremely specific about this. They do not describe the plants and animals of the ancient world as products of a natural evolutionary process that had unfolded on its own. They describe them as inhabitants of a garden that had been laid out and populated by design. The garden was called Eden, and the word survives, with the specific vowel changes that centuries of transmission tend to produce, as the Eden that appears in the opening chapters of the Book of Genesis. The correspondence is not accidental. The Book of Genesis, in the form we now have it, was compiled during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century before Christ, from sources that were much older. The Jewish scribes who did the compiling were living in Mesopotamia. They had access to the temple libraries. They had scholars who could read the older cuneiform. And when they were putting together the opening chapters of their own scripture, they drew, extensively and openly, on the local Sumerian and Babylonian traditions about the origin of the world, the story of the garden, the story of the two trees, the story of the first man and woman, the story of the serpent, the story of the expulsion. All of it, in its essentials, is a compressed and reworked version of much older material. Material that in its original form was not religious poetry. It was the operational record of the biosphere management program that had been established by the Anunnaki when they first set up shop on this planet. The Sumerian Eden, according to the tablets, was not a single small paradise located somewhere in the Near East. It was a vast region. It corresponded, in the tablet's geography, to the great plain that stretches from the head of the Persian Gulf up through what is now Iraq and into eastern Turkey and western Iran. It was, in effect, all of Mesopotamia. And within this region, the Anunnaki had established a series of specific installations that together constituted the biological infrastructure of the operation. There were plantations, there were orchards, there were animal enclosures, there were what would now be called breeding programs. There were, according to the tablets, specific places where new species were being developed, tested, and released into the general biosphere, once they had been verified to be stable and useful. The point of all of this activity, in the earliest phase of the operation, was to provide for the personnel. The Anunnaki, though they lived long, and though their physiology was in some ways different from ours, still had to eat. They had preferred foods. They had specific nutritional requirements, and when they first arrived on Earth, they found that the local biosphere, though rich, did not contain everything they needed in the forms they preferred. And so they did what any competent colonial administration would do. They modified, they brought seed stock from home, or they engineered it locally from raw material found on the planet, and they introduced new plants and new animals into the Mesopotamian landscape that had not been there before. The domestic crops that would later become the foundation of human agriculture, wheat and barley and lentils and chickpeas, and the specific varieties of grape and fig and olive that the region eventually became famous for, all of these, according to the tablets, were originally the products of the Anunnaki cultivation program. They were made, they were selected, they were designed to grow in specific soils under specific conditions and to produce specific yields for specific nutritional purposes. And when the workers were finally created and brought into the fields to tend them, the crops that they tended were the ones the Anunnaki had prepared for them to tend. The domestic animals were part of the same program. The tablets describe, in various places, the introduction of specific breeds of cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and donkeys into the region as part of the setup of the operation. Each of these species had a wild ancestor that was already present on the planet. What the Anunnaki did was take those wild ancestors and modify them, domesticate them, in the modern sense, reduce their aggression, increase their productivity, alter their coat color, or their horn shape, or their reproductive cycle, in ways that made them easier to manage in the confinement of the plantations and the pens. And the specific breeds that resulted from this process are, in some cases, still with us. The lineage of the modern domestic sheep, for example, can be traced back through genetic studies to a founder population that was clearly separated from its wild ancestor at a very early date, in a very specific region, and in a manner that suggests a deliberate act of breeding rather than a slow gradient of coevolution with human herders. What the geneticists say cautiously, the Sumerians said directly. The sheep were made, the goats were made, the cattle were made. And when the humans eventually took over the management of these animals from the Anunnaki, they inherited a complete agricultural package that had been designed, tested, and standardized before they existed. This is why the emergence of agriculture in the archaeological record looks the way it does. It looks sudden. It looks packaged. It looks, at multiple sites across the Fertile Crescent and beyond, as if a fully developed suite of crops and livestock appeared simultaneously in a landscape that had previously supported only hunter-gatherers. The mainstream explanation for this suddenness is the Neolithic Revolution, a period roughly 10,000 years ago when climate change, population pressure, and the accumulated ingenuity of local human groups combined to produce the transition to farming. This explanation is not wrong, exactly. Something did happen in the Fertile Crescent around that time, but the Sumerian version is more specific. It says that the transition to farming was not, at its origin, a human innovation. It was a technology transfer. The humans, once they had been created and once their numbers had grown to the point where they could sustain themselves outside the mines, were given the tools of agriculture by the Anunnaki. The tools were already in existence. The crops were already growing in the plantations. The animals were already living in the enclosures. What happened, in the tablet's account, was that the operation was scaled up. The plantations were expanded. The workers were taught to manage them. And what had originally been a small provisioning operation for a foreign administrative class became, over time, the agricultural base of the entire human civilization that would eventually replace them. There is a passage in one of the tablets, a text sometimes called the myth of the pickaxe, in which the specific moment of the technology transfer is described. Enlil, the administrator, is standing in front of the assembly of the newly created humans. He holds up a tool. It is a pickaxe, or an adze, or a hoe, or some agricultural implement whose exact identification varies with the translator. He explains its use. He demonstrates how it is to be held. He shows how it is to be swung. And he tells the humans, in the specific words the tablet preserves, that from this day forward, they are to work the land. They are to grow the food. They are to feed themselves. And they are to feed the Anunnaki, whose work is now to be devoted to higher matters and who will no longer engage in the labor of the fields. The specific transfer of agricultural responsibility, from the makers to the made, is a moment that the tablets record with the same ceremonial care they used to record the original creation of humanity. It was, in the operational logic of the whole system, a formal handover. And the handover was thorough. The humans were given, along with the tools, the knowledge that was needed to use them well. The specific timing of planting and harvest, the specific rotation of crops, the specific management of soil fertility, the specific handling of livestock, the specific techniques of irrigation, without which agriculture in the arid climate of southern Mesopotamia would have been impossible. All of it was passed down. Some of it was passed down in the form of direct instruction, from Anunnaki to human, in the earliest phase. Some of it was preserved in the form of temple traditions, priestly knowledge, oral chants and rituals whose real content was practical rather than spiritual. And some of it was written down, on tablets, in specific technical texts whose survival is one of the most remarkable features of the whole Mesopotamian archive. There is a Sumerian text called the Farmer's Almanac, which reads, when translated, exactly like the Extension Service Bulletin from an agricultural experiment station in the 20th century. It gives specific instructions for the preparation of the land, the timing of the planting, the frequency of the irrigation, the identification of pests, the management of the harvest. It is not folklore, it is not religion, it is technical documentation. And it was preserved and copied and passed on for thousands of years by scribes who understood, in a way that later readers would forget, that the survival of their civilization depended on the accuracy of the information it contained. The biosphere of the Mesopotamian region, in short, was engineered. It was engineered by the Anunnaki for their own purposes, and then it was handed over to the humans they had made, and the humans then took over its maintenance and passed the technology on to their descendants, who took it out of the Fertile Crescent and spread it across the world. Every field of wheat that is being harvested on this planet right now is a distant descendant, both botanically and technologically, of the plantations that the Anunnaki set up in the Eden. Every domesticated sheep grazing on any hillside anywhere is a distant descendant of the flocks that were maintained in the enclosures of the 7 cities. Every irrigation ditch, every plow, every silo, every mill, every one of the specific technologies that make settled agricultural civilization possible traces back, in the Sumerian account, to a specific act of instruction that took place in the earliest days of the operation. We are, in this respect, the inheritors of somebody else's agricultural system. We have been running it for 10,000 years, and we have, in general, done a decent job of it. But we did not invent it. We received it. This is the 5th function of Earth in the tablets. The living system was cultivated. The biosphere was designed for use. And the specific arrangement of the natural world that we now take for granted, the specific plants and animals that surround us in our daily life, the specific ecological relationships that make our civilization possible, all of this is, if the tablets are correct, the residue of a deliberate act of biological engineering that was performed on this planet long before we existed. The Anunnaki did the work. We inherited the product. And every time we sit down to a meal that includes any of the domestic crops or any of the domestic animals that make up the vast majority of what human beings actually eat, we are eating from a table that was, at its ultimate origin, set by someone else. And there is one further point to make about the biosphere function, because it becomes important for what comes later in the story. The garden was not only made, it was also maintained, meaning that the Anunnaki, having stocked the biosphere with the species they wanted, did not simply walk away and let the system run itself. They watched. They adjusted. They intervened when things went wrong. And they had, according to the tablets, a specific set of technologies for doing so. They could modify the weather. They could redirect rivers. They could manage populations of pests and predators. They could, when necessary, wipe out entire species that had become inconvenient. And in the great climatic upheavals that punctuate the geological record of the last several 100,000 years, in the sudden extinctions and the sudden reappearances and the sudden shifts in the pattern of glaciation and rainfall, some readers have seen the fingerprints of exactly this kind of active management. The record is disputed. The interpretations are contested. But the Sumerians were, on this point, unambiguous. The garden was tended. The gardeners were the Anunnaki. And when the gardeners eventually left, they did not turn off the systems that had kept the garden running. Those systems, in one form or another, are still running, which is why the biosphere we now inhabit has features, when examined carefully, that look designed rather than evolved. Because, if the tablets are correct, they were designed, and the designer was not us. Before the sixth function, stop. What you just heard about the garden only makes sense on the full timeline. Next to the 6 resets before it, 4 already logged, 1 erased the gardeners. It is all in the 7 resets, linked below. Grab it, come back. What is next builds on it. QR on screen. The 6th function of Earth, according to the Sumerian record, was the storage of memory. And this is where the account begins to sound, to a modern reader, less like industrial infrastructure and more like something out of a science fiction novel. Because what the tablets say, in unusually detailed language, is that the Anunnaki established on this planet a repository, a physical archive, a specific place where certain kinds of information were to be kept, preserved, and consulted whenever the operation required it. And the information in question was of a kind that a purely industrial mining operation would not have needed. It included, in the tablet's descriptions, the genetic templates of every organism that had been introduced into the Eden. It included the astronomical records that had been gathered over the centuries of observation. It included the personnel records of every Anunnaki who had served on the surface. It included the technical drawings of the ships, the mines, the pyramids, the ziggurats, and the specific tools that had been developed for the operation. It included, in one particularly striking passage, what the tablets call the words of the past, which is to say, the accumulated language, literature, and history of not only Earth but of Nibiru itself, all preserved in a form that could be consulted whenever the personnel or their successors needed to know something. The specific location of this archive is a matter of some dispute among students of the Sumerian record. Some of the tablets place it in a subterranean chamber beneath the Ikur at Nippur. Others place it in a hidden vault in Egypt, connected in some way to the Giza Plateau installation. Still others suggest that there was not one archive but many, distributed across the network of the 7 cities, each holding a different portion of the material, and that the whole system was linked in a way the tablets do not fully explain, so that a query made at one location could retrieve information stored at another. Whichever version is closest to the original, the point is the same. The Anunnaki, having established their operation on this planet, took steps to preserve the memory of what they had done and were doing, in a physical form, in specific places, for a duration measured in tens of thousands of years. Why did they do this? The tablets offer several answers, and they are worth considering carefully because they tell us something important about the temperament of the beings the Sumerians were describing. One answer is prudence. The Anunnaki knew, from experience with previous colonial operations elsewhere in their sphere of influence, that memory has a habit of failing. Personnel rotate, records get lost, old procedures are forgotten, and when a crisis arrives, the operators find themselves reaching for information that used to be common knowledge, but that has, over the generations, quietly disappeared. The archive was a hedge against this, a guarantee that no matter what happened to the operation, no matter which personnel were on duty when a crisis struck, the information necessary to respond would be somewhere it could be consulted. A second answer is legal. The Anunnaki, in the tablet's account, were subject to some kind of authority beyond themselves. Anu, the Sky Lord, was not a solitary figure. He was, according to certain passages, the head of a council. The council existed on the homeworld. It had rules. It kept records of its own. And every operation that was conducted in the field on any of the worlds where the Anunnaki maintained a presence was ultimately answerable to the Council for its conduct. The archive on Earth was, in part, a compliance mechanism. It documented the operation, it preserved the decisions that had been made. It provided a record that could be consulted whenever the Council on the homeworld wanted to review what had been done on this specific planet by this specific administrative team. In modern language, we would call it an audit trail. The Sumerians did not have that phrase. They used the language they had, which was the language of testimony and witness, but the function they were describing was the same. A third answer, and this is the one that makes the whole picture most interesting, is that the archive was intended to survive the operators. The Anunnaki, according to the tablets, understood that their presence on Earth was not permanent. Sooner or later they would leave. The mines would eventually be exhausted, or the political situation on the homeworld would shift, or the specific reasons for maintaining the operation would go away, and the Anunnaki would pack up and depart. And when they did, they would leave behind them a population of manufactured humans, still living on the surface, still trying to make sense of the world they had inherited. The archive was intended to be readable, at some point in the future, by those humans. Not immediately, not while the memory of the Anunnaki was still fresh, but eventually, when the humans had developed the tools of civilization far enough to be capable of decoding it, when they had become curious enough about their own origins to go looking, when they had, in short, grown up enough to be trusted with the truth. Whether this last claim is correct is impossible to verify, but it is one of the more haunting passages in the whole Sumerian corpus, because it suggests that the operation was designed with a long endgame in mind, that the Anunnaki did not merely extract the metal and leave, that they left behind, on purpose, a kind of message in a bottle, a record of what had been done, addressed to whoever might eventually be able to read it, and that we, the ones now sitting in front of screens debating whether the tablets should be taken seriously, are exactly the audience that message was intended for. This is, of course, a very grand claim, but the tablets make it. And if you read the specific passages in which it is made, they do not read like poetry. They read like the instructions attached to a time capsule. The physical form of the archive is described in various passages, and while the descriptions do not always agree, certain features recur. The archive contained tablets, not clay tablets, something else. The tablets are described as being made of a material that would not degrade. They were smooth, they were dark. They bore markings that would remain legible for what the Sumerians describe as ages beyond counting. Some passages suggest that the tablets were arranged in a specific order on shelves that ran the length of a great chamber. Other passages suggest that the tablets were bound together, in some fashion, into what the Sumerians describe as books, though the specific form of these books is not fully clear. And some passages, the strangest of all, suggest that the archive was not merely a physical collection but an active system, that the tablets, when consulted, could produce responses, that they could speak in the language of the consulter, that they could, in effect, be interrogated by a trained specialist who knew the proper procedures. If any of this is true, then what the tablets are describing is a technology that we do not yet possess, and that the Anunnaki, in their own operational context, apparently did. A form of information storage that combines the durability of a physical medium with the interactivity of a computational one. Something that could hold vast quantities of data over vast spans of time and could still, when accessed by the appropriate procedures, return that data in a useful form. This is not something a human civilization of the 3rd millennium before Christ could have invented in its imagination. It is not a category that existed in the world the Sumerians actually lived in, but it is a category the Sumerians described. And they described it as something that existed physically on this planet, in specific places, at a specific historical period, before their own civilization arose. The persistence of this idea in the traditions of later cultures is striking. The Egyptian priests of Thoth were said to preserve, in their temples, a collection of 42 books that contained the totality of the sacred knowledge. The Hebrew rabbinical tradition preserved, in various forms, the idea of a book of primordial wisdom that had been given to Adam and passed down through the generations before the flood. The Greek philosopher Plato, writing in the 4th century before Christ, described in his dialogues a lost civilization called Atlantis, whose priests had preserved records of a great antiquity in stone. The Islamic tradition preserved the story of the Emerald Tablet, attributed to a figure called Hermes Trismegistus, on which the fundamental truths of the universe were said to be inscribed. Every one of these traditions, in its own local vocabulary, is preserving the memory of the same thing, a collection of knowledge, held in physical form, in a specific place, going back to a time before written history. And every one of them, if the Sumerian record is the source, is a distant echo of the archive that the Anunnaki established on Earth. Now, has any of this been found? The honest answer is no, not so far. There have been claims, there have been rumors of hidden chambers beneath the Sphinx, of sealed vaults beneath temple sites in Egypt and Iraq, of subterranean libraries buried under the sand of the Sinai and the Sahara. Every so often, a new claim is made. An expedition is announced. Ground-penetrating radar reveals what appears to be a void beneath a known monument. Excitement builds. And then, very often, the promised excavation does not happen, or when it happens, it does not find what was expected, or when it finds something, it is not released to the public. Whether this pattern reflects a genuine attempt by modern authorities to control the release of embarrassing information, or whether it simply reflects the ordinary difficulties of doing archaeology in politically sensitive regions, is a matter on which reasonable people disagree. But the pattern is there, and it fuels, in a way that is difficult to argue with, the suspicion that something is being kept from public view. There is one physical object, however, that deserves to be mentioned, because it is the closest thing the archaeological record has produced to what the Sumerian Tablets describe as the archive. It is a set of small metallic plates discovered in 1952 in a cave in Ecuador by a Hungarian-Argentine explorer named Juan Morich. Morich claimed that he had found, deep in a system of tunnels beneath the Andes, a library of thousands of thin metal sheets, bound together with metal wire, bearing inscriptions in a script he did not recognize. The tunnels, he said, were artificial. They ran for miles. They connected, according to local indigenous traditions, to other tunnels that ran across the entire South American continent and beyond. Morich reported his find to the Ecuadorian government. He gave interviews. He led at least one prominent expedition to the site, accompanied by the Swiss author Erich von Daniken, who described what he saw in a book that became a bestseller in the 1970s. And then, in the way these things tend to go, the site was closed to the public. Later investigations were unable to confirm the existence of the metal library. Morix himself, before his death, gave contradictory accounts of exactly where the entrance had been. And whether the library ever existed, and whether it was what he claimed it was, is now impossible to establish. But the story is worth mentioning, not because it proves anything, it does not, but because it is one of many stories, from many parts of the world, in many different cultural contexts, that preserve the same core idea. The idea of a physical archive of ancient knowledge, hidden in the earth, waiting to be found. The idea that somewhere, if you know where to look, there is a record. And the record is not just a myth. The record is a specific set of objects, in a specific place, containing information that would fundamentally change what we know about our own past. The Sumerians said this. The Egyptians said this. The Hebrews said this. The Greeks said this. The traditions of pre-Columbian America said this. And the specific description that recurs in all of these traditions, of small durable plates or sheets or leaves, bearing inscriptions in a language the ordinary reader cannot decipher, is remarkably consistent. Consistent enough that it becomes difficult to dismiss as pure invention. Consistent enough that it forces a modern reader to consider, at least for a moment, that behind the many local versions there might be a single original thing. A single physical archive, established by the Anunnaki, distributed or duplicated across multiple sites, and, in one form or another, still present somewhere on this planet. This was, if the tablets are to be believed, the sixth function of Earth: to hold the memory, to preserve the record, to carry, in a form durable enough to survive the departure of the operators, the story of what had been done and the identity of the ones who had done it. And the story is, in one respect, still being told. It is being told by the surviving Sumerian tablets themselves, because the tablets are not, strictly speaking, the archive. The archive is something else, something older, something more comprehensive. The tablets are the copies, the excerpts, the summaries that the Sumerian scribes produced for their own local use, drawing on the deeper record that had been left in their care. And when Ashurbanipal, thousands of years later, ordered the great library at Nineveh to be assembled, he was not creating anything new. He was assembling copies of copies of copies of the original material, which is why his library has been so important to the recovery of the story, because it preserved, in a form that eventually survived, a substantial portion of a record that would otherwise have been lost. The archive, then, was function 6, and the archive tells us something important about the way the Anunnaki thought about their own operation on this planet. They thought about it as something that would end. They thought about it as something that would leave physically and administratively, and yet leave behind a residue that would persist. They thought about it, in short, in exactly the way that a responsible party would think about any long-term project, with an eye to what comes after, with attention to the specific artifacts that would be left in the ground for later parties to find. And this brings us to the 7th function of Earth, because a project of this scale, running for tens of thousands of years, involving multiple generations of personnel, producing a manufactured biological workforce, and modifying the very biosphere of an inhabited planet, is not something that can be run without oversight. It requires supervisors. It requires committees. It requires, in the specific language of the tablets, an assembly, a place where decisions could be made, a place where disputes could be settled, a place where the leadership of the operation could meet in physical form and hash out the specific policies that would govern what was being done and how it was being done and to whom. And that place was on Earth. It was not on the homeworld, it was here. And the specific location of that assembly and the specific decisions that were made there form one of the most consequential parts of the whole Sumerian story. The 7th function of Earth, in the Sumerian record, was governance. This planet was the seat of a council, and the council in question was not a local matter. It was the standing administrative body for the entire Anunnaki presence in this region of space, and its decisions carried weight far beyond the surface on which it met. The tablets describe the council in considerable detail. They give the number of members, which was 50. They give the ranking of the seats, which was strict. They give the specific procedures by which motions were introduced, debated, and adopted. They give the names of the presiding officers and the specific ceremonial objects that were used to open and close each session. And they give, in numerous specific instances, the actual decisions that the council reached on specific matters that came before it. The name of this body, in the tablets, is the Assembly of the Anunnaki. It was chaired, when he was present, by Anu himself. When Anu was absent, which was most of the time, the chair passed to Enlil. The membership was made up of the senior Anunnaki who held operational commands on Earth, plus a rotating group of representatives from the fleet in orbit and, occasionally, delegates who came in from the homeworld to observe or participate in specific matters. The venue for the Assembly's meetings varied over the long span of the operation. Some passages placed the meetings at Nippur, in a specific chamber within the Akur, high up on the top tier, where Enlil's own quarters were also located. Other passages placed them at a floating platform above the mines. Still others describe an outdoor amphitheater in a mountainous region, possibly in what is now Turkey or the Caucasus, where the members would gather in the open air for particularly weighty deliberations. The exact venue is less important than the fact that the assembly existed as an institution and that its authority was recognized by all of the personnel involved in the operation. The specific matters that came before the assembly, according to the tablets, were varied and interesting. They included, in the earliest phase of the operation, the resolution of the Igigi mutiny that we have already discussed. They included the authorization of the initial genetic engineering program that produced the first humans. They included the specific decision about which lands would be assigned to which of the senior Anunnaki as their personal territories. They included the arbitration of disputes between Enlil and Enki, which were frequent and sometimes serious, over specific questions of policy. They included the setting of quotas for the mines, the review of astronomical data that had implications for the timing of the fleet's arrivals, the sanctioning of specific personnel who had violated the operational protocols, and the authorization or denial of requests from members of the leadership for permission to undertake unusual activities that fell outside the normal scope of the operation. In short, the assembly did everything a senior committee of a large enterprise would do. It made policy, it resolved disputes, it set budgets, it approved actions, and its decisions, once made, were binding on all the personnel involved in the operation, from the highest-ranking members of the leadership down to the newly created humans working in the fields. There is one specific decision made by the assembly that deserves detailed attention, because it is the decision that shapes everything that follows in the Sumerian story. And that is the decision, taken after long and bitter debate, to permit the flood. We will come to the flood as its own function of the planet in a moment, because the specific role of the flood in the operational logic of the Anunnaki presence is worth examining in its own right. But the decision to allow the flood to happen was, in every version of the tablets that survives, made by the assembly. It was Enlil who proposed the measure. It was Enki who opposed it. It was Anu who ultimately gave the ruling. And the vote of the 50 was recorded in the specific procedural language that the assembly's sessions used, in a form that the scribes preserved word for the benefit of the future. The debate over the flood is preserved, in various versions, in tablets that survive today. Enlil's arguments are given at length. The humans, he says, have become too many. They have spread too far. Their noise disturbs the rest of the Anunnaki. Their reproductive success is uncontrolled. They are consuming resources at a rate that was never intended. And, most importantly, they have begun to interbreed with the lower ranks of the Anunnaki themselves, producing hybrids whose status within the operation is uncertain and whose presence complicates the chain of command. Enlil's proposal is that the whole thing be reset, that a natural catastrophe be permitted to occur without intervention, and that the human population be substantially reduced to a level at which the operation can be maintained without further complication. Enki's counter-arguments are also preserved. He argues that the humans were made for a purpose, that they have served that purpose faithfully, that the specific difficulties Enlil has identified are the result of poor management rather than of any inherent flaw in the design, that the humans should be given the tools they need to correct their own course, that the wholesale destruction of a species that was manufactured by the Anunnaki themselves is a violation of the very responsibility that the Anunnaki accepted when they undertook the project. Anu, according to the tablets, listens to both sides. He deliberates, and in the end, he rules in favor of Enlil. The flood is authorized. The specific timing is left to the natural cycles of the planet. The Anunnaki are ordered to withdraw to safe locations, to secure their equipment, and to allow the event to proceed. But Enki does not comply. Or rather, he complies with the letter of the ruling while violating its spirit. He does not directly warn the humans of what is coming. He is bound by his oath to the assembly not to do so, but he finds a way. He goes to the reed hut of a specific human, a man he has selected for the purpose, a righteous and capable individual named Ziusudra in the Sumerian version, and Utnapishtim in the later Babylonian version, and Noah in the still later Hebrew version. And Enki speaks not to the man himself but to the reeds of the hut. He tells the reeds what is coming. He tells the reeds how to build a specific kind of vessel that will survive the coming waters. He tells the reeds what to load onto the vessel. And Ziusudra, sleeping inside the hut, overhears the warning of Enki through the wall. He wakes, he builds, he loads. And when the waters come, he and his family and a substantial cross-section of the domestic biosphere are preserved. The tablets record what happens after. The Anunnaki themselves, watching from their ships in orbit and from the peaks of the tallest mountains, are shocked by the scale of the destruction. They weep. They tear their garments. Ninhursag, the birth goddess, is depicted as beside herself with grief at the fate of the creatures she had made. Even Enlil, who had authorized the whole thing, is described as sobered by what he witnesses. And when the waters recede, and when Ziusudra emerges from his vessel and offers the traditional sacrifice, the Anunnaki gather around him. They are, in the specific language of the tablets, drawn to the smell of the offering the way flies are drawn to a corpse. Because they have been in orbit for the duration of the flood, their supplies are exhausted. They have not eaten in weeks, and the sight of a surviving human offering them food is, at that moment, a reprieve. Enlil is angry that Enki has evaded the ruling of the assembly. He confronts Enki at the site of the sacrifice. There is a bitter exchange, and in the end, Enlil accepts what has happened. The humans will not be exterminated. They will continue. Ziusudra is granted an extraordinary status, a form of immortality within the operation, and the family that has survived is given permission to repopulate the surface of the earth and to serve as the ancestors of the entire human civilization that will eventually rise from their descendants. All of this, every bit of it, was decided by the assembly. The assembly authorized the flood. The assembly failed to anticipate that Enki would find a workaround. The assembly, after the fact, ratified the outcome and permitted the human population to continue. And in every subsequent decision that shaped the arc of human history within the operational period, the assembly was the ultimate authority. When cities were founded, the assembly approved it. When territories were assigned, the assembly ruled on it. When wars broke out between rival Anunnaki lords over the boundaries of their respective domains, and there were several such wars, some of them extremely destructive, the assembly was the body that ultimately mediated. And when the decision was finally made, near the end of the operational period, to withdraw the Anunnaki presence from the surface of the earth, and to hand over the ongoing management of the planet to the humans themselves, that decision too was made by the assembly, in a specific session, on a specific date, recorded in a specific way. And the closing of the assembly, in the last tablets of the operational period, is one of the most solemn passages in the whole surviving record. The assembly's existence has implications that reach far beyond the specific decisions it made. It tells us something important about the political culture of the beings the tablets are describing. They were not autocrats. They were not a single ruler in his court. They were a governing body, with procedures and precedents, and a formal system of debate and vote. They took decisions collectively. They were bound by their own rules. They could be, and sometimes were, overruled by their own institutions. This is not the profile of a group of primitive gods invented by a superstitious people to explain the weather. This is the profile of a functioning administrative civilization, complete with all the political structures such a civilization requires. And the fact that the Sumerians preserved this profile in such detail, and preserved it accurately enough that certain features of it, like the number 50 for the size of the council, are echoed in other ancient traditions, suggests that they were not making it up. They were describing something they had inherited a memory of, something that had actually existed, and something whose institutions had shaped the specific arc of what happened on this planet during the operational period and beyond. The assembly, as an institution, did not survive the withdrawal of the Anunnaki from the surface. Once the leadership departed, the 50 seats stood empty. The chamber at Nippur, or wherever the assembly had last convened, was closed. The specific procedures were forgotten by all but the priests who preserved them in ritualized form for many generations after their original meaning had been lost. But the memory of the assembly persisted. It persisted in the Sumerian tradition, where the king lists preserve the names of the ancient rulers, as figures whose right to govern was derived, ultimately, from the delegation of authority by the ancient council. It persisted in the Babylonian tradition, where the great annual New Year festival at Babylon included a ritual reenactment of the assembly's decisions, with the priests taking the roles of the various Anunnaki lords. It persisted in the Hebrew tradition, where the specific number 70 for the council of elders that surrounded Moses in the Sinai is not far from the 50 that had made up the original assembly, and where the specific procedures by which decisions were reached were modeled on the ancient patterns. It persisted, in various distorted forms, in the political theologies of every civilization that grew up in the region for the next 3,000 years. And it persists, in one respect, to this day, because the specific idea that authority is not vested in a single individual but in a deliberating body that follows procedures and reaches decisions collectively is one of the most durable political ideas in human history. It has been forgotten and rediscovered many times. It has taken many local forms. It has been implemented well, and it has been implemented badly. But it has survived. It is one of the specific inheritances that we carry forward from the operational period, according to the tablets. And every deliberative body that has ever gathered in a chamber, taken a vote, and been bound by the result is, in a certain sense, the distant institutional descendant of the assembly of the Anunnaki that used to meet, in the earliest days of this planet's occupation, in a chamber at the top of a stepped tower in the city of Nippur. This was the seventh function of Earth. It was the seat of a government, and the government, for the specific period during which the operation was active, was something that shaped this world in ways whose consequences we are still, whether we know it or not, living with. The eighth function of Earth, in the Sumerian record, was atmospheric. It was a laboratory for the management of climate, and the specific reason this function existed is one of the more instructive parts of the whole account, because it forces a modern reader to consider a possibility that runs directly against the assumptions of contemporary environmental science. Namely, that the climate of this planet, over the course of the operational period, was not entirely a product of natural forces. It was, in specific and demonstrable ways, adjusted. The story begins with a technical problem. The Anunnaki, having established their base on Earth and having begun the extraction of metal from Africa and the establishment of installations in Mesopotamia, discovered that the local climate was not entirely cooperative. Certain regions that they wanted to use for agriculture were too dry. Certain regions that they wanted to use for personnel housing were too cold. The distribution of rainfall was uneven in ways that did not suit their purposes. The specific seasonal patterns of temperature and precipitation, which had evolved on the planet over billions of years to serve the interests of no one in particular, did not conveniently align with the operational calendar the Anunnaki wanted to run. And so, according to the tablets, they began to adjust. The technology by which this adjustment was performed is described in language that a modern reader must struggle to interpret. There are references, in the tablets, to devices that could summon rain from a clear sky. There are references to specific rites, conducted by specific personnel at specific locations, that resulted in the arrival or the departure of storms. There are references to the deliberate warming of certain latitudes and the deliberate cooling of others, in ways that were coordinated across the network of installations and that produced, over a long period, the specific climatic pattern that the Anunnaki wanted the surface of the Earth to have. Whether these descriptions reflected genuine technological capability, or whether they are the misremembered accounts of coincidental weather events, is a question the tablets themselves cannot fully answer. But the descriptions are there. They are consistent. They are internally coherent. And they are attributed, in every case, to specific members of the Anunnaki leadership acting on the authority of the assembly. The most striking claim in this whole area of the record is that the Anunnaki had, at their disposal, the capability to induce large-scale precipitation events on demand. Rain machines, in the language of a science fiction novel. The tablets do not use that phrase. They use the specific language of ritual and command, in which a particular Anunnaki lord would go to a particular installation, would perform a particular procedure, and would then be followed within hours or days by a downpour of extraordinary intensity in the region of the installation's coverage. This capability, according to the tablets, was used for beneficial purposes most of the time. It filled the reservoirs, it watered the crops, it refreshed the pastures. But it was also, on at least one very specific occasion, used for something else. It was used, in the specific event we have already discussed, to induce the flood. The Sumerian flood, in other words, was not entirely a natural event. It was, according to the tablets, an act of planetary engineering. The assembly authorized it. The specific Anunnaki lords who had the capability to induce large-scale weather events implemented it. And the ordinary climatic systems of the planet were, over a specific period of time, deliberately amplified until they produced a catastrophe of the magnitude the tablets describe. Whether this claim is literally true, or whether the tablets are attributing to the Anunnaki a set of events that were actually the result of natural forces that happened to coincide with a period of political controversy, is a question that reasonable interpreters differ on. But the tablets are clear about what they say. The flood was not accidental. It was planned. It was executed. And it was, in the specific administrative logic of the operation, a demonstration of a capability that the Anunnaki possessed and did not want their subordinates to forget. Beyond the flood, the tablets describe other, less dramatic instances of atmospheric management. There are references to the deliberate suppression of storms that would have interfered with the arrival of specific fleets. There are references to the deliberate acceleration of the seasonal cycle in specific regions to permit the harvesting of multiple crops per year. There are references to the deliberate cooling of specific mountain ranges to preserve the glaciers that fed the rivers on which the operation depended. All of this was done, according to the tablets, on the authority of the assembly, by personnel who understood what they were doing, using tools whose specific nature is not fully described but whose effects are recorded with considerable precision. And there is one further claim, in this general area, that deserves specific attention. The Sumerians said that the Anunnaki, in the course of managing the climate, had also managed the specific composition of the atmosphere, not just the weather, the air itself, the proportions of the gases that made up the breathable envelope of the planet, and the specific chemical balance that allowed both the Anunnaki personnel and the biosphere they had established to thrive. This is a much larger claim than the weather claim, because it implies a level of technical capability that goes far beyond what any human civilization has ever achieved. But the tablets make it. They describe, in specific passages, the initial assessment of the terrestrial atmosphere by Enki and his team at the beginning of the operation. They describe the specific adjustments that were determined to be necessary. They describe the release, over a long period of time, of specific quantities of specific substances into the atmosphere to bring it into line with the desired specification. And they describe the maintenance of this modified atmosphere over the entire operational period as a continuous background task that was assigned to specific personnel and was performed by them without incident until the very end of the operation, when the leadership departed and the maintenance was, quietly and without ceremony, discontinued. If this claim is even approximately true, it has enormous implications for how we understand the specific composition of the atmosphere we now breathe. Because the current mix of gases in the atmosphere of Earth is, From the perspective of pure chemistry, unusual. The oxygen concentration is high. The carbon dioxide concentration is low. The nitrogen concentration is very high. The specific ratios do not match what would be expected from the geological outgassing of a planet of this size at this distance from a star of this type. Something has been maintaining the ratios at their current values over a period of hundreds of millions of years, and mainstream science attributes this something to the ongoing activity of the biosphere itself. Photosynthetic organisms produce the oxygen. Respiratory organisms consume the carbon dioxide. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria maintain the nitrogen cycle. All of this is well established, and none of it depends on any hypothesis of external intervention. But the Sumerians said that at the beginning of the operational period, the atmosphere was not entirely in balance. That specific adjustments had to be made. That the balance was subsequently maintained by a combination of biological and technological means. And that the specific atmospheric composition we now enjoy is, in some measure, the residue of that adjustment. This claim is impossible to verify. It leaves no direct fingerprint in the geological record that could be distinguished from the effects of the biosphere itself. But it is worth mentioning, because it suggests a particular way of thinking about the planet we live on. It suggests that the specific conditions under which we thrive are not simply the accidental gift of a favorable star and a lucky distance from that star, and a fortunate history of volcanic activity. It suggests that those conditions may have been, at some point in the past, deliberately arranged. And it suggests that the maintenance of those conditions, if it depends on the continued functioning of systems that we do not fully understand, is not something we should take for granted. This is a sobering thought, and the Sumerians, in their tablets, treat it soberly. The atmospheric management function of the Earth was, in their account, one of the most delicate parts of the whole operation. It required constant attention. It could not be neglected. And when the Anunnaki eventually departed, they left behind, according to the tablets, specific instructions for the humans about the care and maintenance of the biosphere and the atmosphere that supported it. Instructions that were preserved, in symbolic form, in the temple traditions of the early civilizations that inherited the operation. Instructions that included specific injunctions against the wanton destruction of forests, the pollution of rivers, the exhaustion of soils, and the release of noxious substances into the air. These instructions have not, on the whole, been followed. The specific consequences of ignoring them are now becoming increasingly visible in the environmental crises of the 21st century. And whether the Sumerians were right in their claim that the atmosphere is something that was arranged and must be maintained rather than something that maintains itself automatically, is a question that the next few generations are likely to have to answer whether they want to or not. The atmospheric function, in short, was the 8th of the 10 purposes for which this planet was assembled. And it was the one that most directly connected the operational logic of the Anunnaki presence to the ordinary daily conditions of life on the surface. The gold mines were remote. The genetic laboratory was a specialized facility. The astronomical stations were the province of a small class of trained observers. But the atmosphere was everywhere. It touched every organism on the surface of the planet. And its careful management was, according to the tablets, one of the ongoing responsibilities of the leadership from the beginning of the operation to its end. There is one further point to make, and it is a difficult one, because it touches on a specific aspect of the Sumerian record that is much more disturbing than most of what we have discussed so far. The tablets suggest that the atmospheric management capability the Anunnaki possessed was not always used for beneficial purposes. There are specific passages in which weather modification is used as a weapon. There are specific passages in which drought is deliberately induced in the territories of rival Anunnaki lords to force them into political concessions. There are specific passages in which storms are directed against specific human populations that have become inconvenient to reduce their numbers or drive them out of specific regions. And there is one particularly disturbing passage, preserved in the Epic of Era, in which the deliberate poisoning of the atmosphere over a specific region is used as a form of collective punishment with catastrophic consequences for the biosphere and the human population downwind. This use of atmospheric technology as a weapon is one of the darker threads in the Sumerian record. It suggests that the Anunnaki, though they were capable of extraordinary technical achievements, were not always benevolent in the exercise of their powers. They were, in the tablet's unflinching depiction, subject to the same political failings as any other governing class throughout history. They had rivalries. They pursued their own interests. They used the tools at their disposal, including tools that could reshape the climate and the atmosphere of an entire planet, to advance those interests when they thought they could get away with it. And the specific consequences of these misuses were sometimes so severe that they left permanent scars on the biosphere and on the human population that lived downstream of them. Some of these scars, if the tablets are to be taken seriously, are still visible in the geological and archaeological record today. This dark aspect of the eighth function should not be avoided. It is part of the story the tablets tell, and it is part of the reason why the Sumerians, when they preserved this material for the future, did so with a certain urgency. They understood that the technologies they were describing, if they were ever rediscovered by a subsequent civilization, could be used for great harm as well as great good. They understood that a species that could manipulate the climate of its own planet was a species that could destroy its own planet, whether intentionally or through carelessness. And they preserved the record, in part, as a warning, as a caution to whoever might eventually be able to read it, that the powers being described in the tablets were not gifts, they were responsibilities. And the consequences of misusing them were, as the tablets themselves demonstrated over and over again, both immediate and enduring. This was the eighth function, and it was, in the operational logic of the whole system, the one that most directly connected the specific decisions of the leadership to the specific conditions under which every organism on the surface of the planet was actually living. Which brings us, at last, to the ninth function of Earth, because the operation, though it was elaborate, though it was long-lasting, though it involved specialists in every field from mining to genetics to atmospheric management, was not intended to run forever. It had, from the beginning, an anticipated conclusion, and a specific set of arrangements had been made for the period after the leadership departed. And those arrangements, and the specific figures who were assigned to implement them, are what the ninth function is all about. The ninth function of Earth, in the Sumerian record, was to serve as a sentinel post, a watching station, a place where certain members of the Anunnaki leadership remained behind after the main body of the operation had withdrawn, to oversee the transition of the planet from Anunnaki management to human self-government, and to intervene if necessary to keep the transition on track. And the specific figures who were assigned to this role are among the most consequential in the whole of ancient Near Eastern religious history, because their names, their functions, and their eventual fates form the raw material out of which the entire spiritual and theological tradition of the region eventually crystallized. To understand this ninth function, you have to understand the specific historical moment that the tablets describe. The operation, at its peak, involved thousands of Anunnaki personnel stationed on Earth. There were the senior lords with their households. There were the middle-ranking officers who commanded specific installations. There were the technical specialists in every field. There were the Igigi, the lower-ranking workers who had returned to their duties after the creation of the humans. And there were the various support personnel, the record keepers and the food handlers and the medical staff, whose specific roles were essential to the smooth functioning of the whole enterprise. All of these people had to be brought back to the ships when the operation ended. All of their equipment had to be recovered or destroyed. All of their installations had to be either sealed or handed over to the humans who would inherit them. The withdrawal was, in the tablet's description, a substantial logistical undertaking that took many years to complete. But not everyone was withdrawn. According to the tablets, a specific decision was made by the assembly, in the final phase of the operational period, to leave behind a certain number of personnel. The exact number varies in different versions of the account. Some tablets say 200, some say 70, some say 12. The variation may reflect different phases of the withdrawal, in which different numbers of personnel remain behind at different times. But the principle was consistent. A residual force was to be maintained on the surface of the Earth, indefinitely, for the specific purpose of overseeing what the tablets call the young civilization. The humans, in other words. The manufactured workforce that had, over the course of the operational period, become something more than a workforce. They had developed language. They had developed culture. They had developed, in the last few thousand years of the operation, the beginnings of what could reasonably be called a civilization of their own. And the assembly, in its final deliberations, decided that this young civilization should not be left entirely alone. It should be watched. It should be, when necessary, guided. And it should be, in the specific language of the tablets, protected from itself. The personnel who were assigned to this residual oversight role are called, in various tablets, by various names. In the earliest Sumerian sources, they are usually referred to as the Igigi who remained. In later Sumerian and Babylonian sources, they are called the Watchers, or the Wakeful Ones. or simply the ones who stayed. In the Hebrew tradition that preserved and reworked much of this material, they became the Beni Elohim, the sons of God, whose descent to the daughters of men is described in the famously puzzling opening passages of the 6th chapter of Genesis. In the later apocryphal tradition, particularly in the Book of Enoch, they became the fallen angels, whose specific names, functions, and eventual punishments are enumerated in extraordinary detail. And in the Islamic tradition, they became the jinn, the invisible beings who inhabit the world alongside humanity, and whose interactions with human affairs are the subject of a substantial body of religious and mystical literature. All of these traditions, in one form or another, are preserving the memory of the same thing. A specific group of the original Anunnaki personnel, or their descendants, who did not depart with the main withdrawal but who remained on the surface of the earth to fulfill the specific oversight function that the assembly had assigned to them. And the specific story of what these residual personnel did, and how their mission eventually went wrong, is one of the most consequential narratives in the whole of ancient religious literature. According to the Book of Enoch, which is the most detailed source we have for this specific part of the story, the residual personnel were, at their peak, 200 in number. They were divided into 10 squads of 20 each, under the command of a chief officer named Semjaza. They were assigned to specific regions of the surface. Their duty was to observe the humans, to record what the humans were doing, and to report their observations back to a coordination center that was itself, according to some traditions, located on a specific mountain that has been variously identified as Mount Hermon in the modern Golan Heights, Mount Ararat in eastern Turkey, or a number of other candidates. And their instructions were strict. They were to observe. They were to record. They were, under no circumstances, to intervene in human affairs beyond what was absolutely necessary. And they were, above all, forbidden to enter into any personal relationships with the humans they had been sent to watch. The instructions were violated. According to the account preserved in the Book of Enoch, the Watchers, over the course of their long assignment on the surface of the earth, began to find the humans attractive, specifically the female humans. The specific passage in the ancient text describes the Watchers looking down from their positions on the mountain and observing the human women moving about their business in the villages of the plain below. Semjaza, their commander, is depicted as being aware of the temptation and as having initially resisted it. But eventually, according to the account, he gathered his officers and proposed to them that they descend to the villages and take the human women as wives. His officers, according to the account, agreed, but they did so on one specific condition. If any of them turned back at the last minute, they would all be held responsible for the transgression. Semjaza agreed to this, and the 200 Watchers descended from their positions and went among the human villages, and each of them chose a human woman and took her as a wife. The consequences, according to the tradition, were extreme. The offspring of these unions were, in the specific language of the ancient texts, giants. They were half human and half something else, and they grew to enormous size, and they consumed food at a rate that exhausted the resources of the villages where they lived, and eventually they turned on the humans themselves and began to devour them. The Watchers, meanwhile, had begun to teach the humans things they had not been authorized to teach: metallurgy, weaponry, cosmetics, the making of dyes and perfumes, the reading of the stars for the purpose of divination rather than for the purpose of navigation, the specific arts of enchantment and spellcasting. And the effect of all this transferred knowledge, according to the account, was to accelerate the corruption of human society and to distort the natural development of the young civilization that the assembly had, in its original design, intended to unfold slowly and organically. The situation eventually became so intolerable that Anu himself, on the homeworld, was informed of what was happening. The assembly reconvened. A decision was taken. The Watchers were to be recalled. Their children were to be dealt with. The knowledge they had transferred was to be, so far as possible, suppressed. And the specific personnel who had led the transgression were to be punished. According to the Book of Enoch, the punishment was severe. The Watchers were bound and imprisoned in a specific location that the text describes as a valley of darkness beneath the surface of the earth, where they would remain until the end of the world. Their offspring, the giants, were exterminated in a series of specific events that the text describes in some detail. And the whole episode was, in the operational memory of the tradition, an example of what could go wrong when personnel were left in place beyond the specific mission for which they had been assigned. Now, the specific historical accuracy of this account is impossible to verify, The Book of Enoch, in the form we have it, was composed in the last few centuries before Christ, drawing on much older traditions but reworking them for its own specific purposes. The specific details of the Watchers, their numbers, their names, their punishments, may or may not correspond to anything that actually happened. But the underlying framework, the framework of a residual oversight force left behind after the main withdrawal, is present in the earliest Sumerian sources. And it fits, with striking coherence, into the larger picture of the operational logic of the whole system. If you were running an operation of the scale and complexity that the tablets describe, and if you were withdrawing your main forces from the surface of a planet you had spent tens of thousands of years developing, you would leave behind a residual monitoring capability. Every colonial administration in human history has done exactly this. The Romans left legions in Britain and Gaul long after the main campaigns of conquest had ended. The British left colonial officers in India long after the East India Company had ceased to function as a commercial entity. The Americans left military bases in Germany and Japan long after the immediate strategic need for them had passed. This is what colonial powers do. They leave a residual force. And that force, over time, tends to develop interests of its own that do not always align with the interests of the original commissioning authority. The Sumerian record, in describing the Watchers, is describing this phenomenon in its ancient form, and the specific problems that the Watchers eventually developed, the drift from their original mission, the entanglement with the local population, the unauthorized transfer of technology, the eventual scandal that required intervention from the homeworld, are exactly the specific problems that residual colonial forces have developed throughout history. This is one of the reasons the Sumerian account has, on close reading, a plausibility that most ancient religious literature lacks. It describes patterns of institutional behavior that are recognizable, from a modern administrative perspective, as the patterns you would actually expect to find. It is not an idealized account. It is not a heroic account. It is a bureaucratic account. And the bureaucratic realism of it is one of the reasons certain modern readers have been unable to shake the suspicion that it is describing something that actually happened. The ninth function of Earth, then, was to be a place where the leaving was not, in the strictest sense, complete, where a residual presence remained, where the transition from Anunnaki management to human self-government was overseen, at least for a time, by personnel who understood what the operation had been about and who had, in some measure, the authority to intervene if the transition went badly wrong. And the specific personnel who fulfilled this function became, in the memory of the humans who lived alongside them, the gods and demigods and heroes and prophets of 100 subsequent religious traditions. The specific individuals whose names appear in the earliest human myths are, in many cases, the specific individuals who had been assigned to the watching role. They were not, in the original sense, divine. They were personnel. They were the residual staff of a departing administration. But the humans who encountered them, and who did not fully understand what they were, remembered them as beings from another world, which, in the specific terms of the operational logic the tablets describe, is exactly what they were. And there is, in the specific arc of the Watcher's story, a final detail that is worth pausing on, because the tablets, and the traditions that grew up around them, agree on one specific point that has enormous consequences for how we understand the current condition of humanity. The Watchers, when they were eventually recalled or imprisoned or otherwise removed from their positions, did not take with them the knowledge they had transferred to the humans. The knowledge stayed. The specific arts of metallurgy and weaponry, and cosmetics and divination remained in human hands, even after the beings who had taught these arts were no longer present to guide their use. And humanity, once it had been given this technology, could not unknow it. The genie could not be put back in the bottle. Whatever the original plan for the slow and organic development of human civilization had been, it was disrupted by the actions of the Watchers, and the disruption was permanent. We are, in the specific view the tablets and their derivative traditions preserve, a civilization that developed too fast, that was given tools it was not ready for, that has, ever since, been struggling to master the specific technologies that were, in one specific episode of profound institutional failure, transferred to it too soon. And the consequences of that transfer are, according to the traditions that grew up around this material, still working themselves out in the political and technological and moral history of the species that we are. The ninth function, in short, was watching. And the watching, when it went wrong, produced the world we now live in. Which brings us, at last, to the 10th and final function of Earth. Because there is one further purpose the tablets ascribe to this planet, and it is by far the strangest and most consequential of the 10. It is the purpose that connects everything that has come before to everything that might, in principle, still come. And it is the purpose that gives the whole Sumerian account of the origin and development of this world its specific weight and meaning. Because everything the Anunnaki did on Earth, everything they built and made and manipulated and destroyed, was, according to the deepest layer of the tradition, ultimately in service of a single further goal. A goal that the operators themselves may not have fully understood at the time. A goal that is only now, thousands of years after the operation ended, becoming visible in what the tablets say and in what humanity has begun to become. The 10th function of Earth, according to the deepest layer of the Sumerian record, was to serve as a cradle, not a cradle for a species. That has already been discussed. The manufacture of the human being at the Bit Shimti was function 2, and it stands on its own. What function 10 describes is something different. It describes the use of the Earth as a nursery for a particular kind of consciousness, a specific mode of awareness, a specific development of the interior life of a species that had, up to this point in the story, been treated purely as a labor force. And the specific claim the tablets make about this function is the one that most modern readers find the most difficult to accept, because it implies that behind everything the Anunnaki thought they were doing on this planet, there was a deeper purpose that they themselves did not fully understand. A purpose whose specific character was to bring into being a kind of awareness that had not existed anywhere in the region before, and whose eventual development would have consequences reaching far beyond the specific operational needs of the mining and cultivation and administration that had motivated the original expedition. This claim is not made explicitly in any single tablet. It emerges, rather, from the specific pattern of what the tablets describe when they describe the humans in the later phases of the operation. In the early tablets, the humans are described purely as workers. They dig, they plow, they obey, they reproduce. They are, in the terms of the operational logic, a biological tool set. But in the later tablets, something changes. The humans begin to be described, in specific passages, as capable of something more. They are described as being able to receive instruction not only in agriculture and metallurgy, but in matters that the tablets call the me, the fundamental categories of existence. They are described as being able to sing hymns, to compose narratives, to build temples that reflect their own understanding of the order of the world, rather merely copying the templates the Anunnaki had given them. They are described, in one particularly striking passage from a late Sumerian text, as being able to look up at the stars at night and to ask questions about them. And the questions they are described as asking are not the questions of a workforce. They are the questions of a species that has begun, in some specific way, to become aware of itself as something more than a workforce. The Anunnaki, according to the tablets, notice this development, and their reactions to it are, in the specific passages that survive, sharply divided. Enlil, the administrator, is depicted as being alarmed by it. He does not want the workers to become philosophical. He does not want them to ask questions. He wants them to work, to obey, and to reproduce. And the specific passages in which he intervenes to suppress what he calls the pride of the humans, to keep them focused on their assigned tasks, and to prevent them from developing intellectual capacities that go beyond what the operation requires, are among the darker passages in the whole record. Enki, on the other hand, is depicted as encouraging the development. He is depicted as spending time among the humans, teaching them, answering their questions, and specifically cultivating in them the very capacities that Enlil wants suppressed. And Enki's justification for doing this, in the specific passages where he explains himself, is that the humans have a potential that the operation was never designed to accommodate, that they are capable of something more than labor, that they are, in the specific phrase preserved in one Sumerian text, becoming something that no one anticipated. What are they becoming? The tablets do not fully answer this question, because the process that is being described was, at the time the tablets were composed, still incomplete. But certain hints are present. The humans, according to the later tablets, are developing what the Sumerians call an inner tablet, a capacity for reflection, a capacity for reasoning that goes beyond the immediate demands of the environment, a capacity, in the most striking passages, for what the modern reader would call moral awareness, the specific ability to consider a course of action, to weigh its consequences, to imagine how it would appear from the perspective of another being, and to choose or refuse it accordingly. This capacity, according to the tablets, was not part of the original specification of the workforce. It was not what the humans were manufactured to have. It emerged, unexpectedly, in the later phases of the operation, as a consequence of the specific conditions under which the humans had been made to live. And it emerged in ways that made the humans, from the perspective of the Anunnaki, both more valuable and more difficult to manage than they had been before. The valuable part is easy to understand. A workforce with moral awareness is a workforce that can be trusted with more complex tasks. It can supervise itself. It can take initiative. It can, over time, develop new techniques and new institutions that the original operators had not thought to build. And in the late phases of the operational period, the humans were increasingly given exactly this kind of expanded responsibility. They were made governors of specific territories. They were made judges in specific disputes. They were made priests in specific temples. They were made kings, under Anunnaki oversight, of specific cities. And their performance in these roles, according to the tablets, was mixed but generally competent. They were, in the specific phrase of one late Sumerian text, ready to be trusted. And this readiness was, from the Anunnaki perspective, an unexpected asset that made possible the eventual transition to human self-government that would follow the withdrawal of the leadership. The difficult part is that a workforce with moral awareness is also a workforce that can, in principle, refuse the work. It can ask why. It can, if the answers to why do not satisfy it, decline to continue. And the tablets record, in the last phases of the operational period, a certain restlessness among the human population that would have been unthinkable in the earlier phases. The humans begin to ask, in the specific narratives that survive, about the ultimate purpose of the operation they have been serving. They begin to ask about their own origins, and about the specific reasons for their creation, and about the specific rights and obligations that flow from those origins. They begin to develop, in short, the first stirrings of what a modern reader would call political consciousness. And the Anunnaki, faced with this development, must decide what to do about it. Enlil, as always, favors suppression. Enki, as always, favors cultivation. And the specific outcome of their argument, in the last few tablets of the operational period, is one of the most interesting parts of the whole story. Enki wins. Not immediately, not decisively, but over the course of a long series of specific decisions taken by the assembly in the final centuries of the operational period, the position that Enki had been arguing for gradually becomes the settled policy of the leadership. The humans are permitted to develop. Their moral awareness is not suppressed. Their political consciousness is not extinguished. Instead, specific institutions are built to accommodate it. Kings are appointed, with specific procedures for their selection and specific limits on their authority. Assemblies of elders are convened, with specific responsibilities for advising the kings and for resolving disputes that the kings cannot resolve themselves. Legal codes are promulgated, with specific principles of justice and specific procedures for the redress of grievances. All of these institutions, which the mainstream historical narrative attributes to the independent invention of the Sumerians and Babylonians and Assyrians, are described in the tablets as the result of specific decisions taken by the assembly of the Anunnaki on the recommendation of Enki. In the last phases of the operational period, the tools of human self-government were, in this account, transferred from the operators to the operated. And the specific reasoning behind the transfer was that the humans had developed to the point where they could handle these tools responsibly, that they had, in the phrase preserved in one specific late tablet, come of age. And this brings us to the deepest meaning of the 10th function. Because if you accept the account the tablets are giving, if you accept that the humans were manufactured for labor but developed unexpectedly into something more, if you accept that the Anunnaki eventually recognized this development and adjusted their operational plans to accommodate it, then the whole arc of the story takes on a shape that is quite different from what you might have expected at the beginning. It is not a story of exploitation, exactly. Or rather, it is a story that begins with exploitation and ends with something else. It is a story of a species that was made for one purpose and turned out to be capable of another. And the 10th function of Earth, in this reading, is not something that was assigned to the planet at the beginning of the operation. It is something that emerged in the course of the operation. It is the specific unexpected development that transformed a mining colony into a cradle. What was the cradle for? What kind of consciousness was Earth, in this final reading, meant to bring into being? The tablets do not fully answer this question, but the traditions that grew up around them offer certain hints. The consciousness that is being cultivated on this planet is, in the specific language of the later religious traditions that descended from the Sumerian source, a consciousness capable of self-direction. A consciousness capable of choosing its own path. A consciousness capable of doing what the Anunnaki, in their long administrative tradition, had never had to do, which was to face the question of its own existence and to answer that question for itself without the guidance of any external authority. The Anunnaki had known where they came from. They had known who their parents were and who their gods were, and what the specific role of their species was in the larger structure of the civilization that had produced them. The humans, in the specific condition the tablets describe them as reaching in the last phases of the operational period, were being cultivated to know none of these things. They were being cultivated, deliberately, to be the kind of beings that would eventually have to figure everything out for themselves. And the specific developmental path that was being prepared for them, in the withdrawal of the Anunnaki and the closing of the operation and the abandonment of the surface installations, was a path of extraordinary difficulty. But it was also, according to the deepest reading of the tradition, a path of extraordinary potential. Because a species that figures things out for itself, without external guidance, is a species that develops capacities of judgment and creativity and moral courage that no externally guided species can ever fully develop. And the 10th function of Earth, in this reading, was to provide the specific conditions under which such a species could emerge and, in the fullness of time, come into its own. This is a very grand claim. It is, in some ways, the grandest claim in the whole tradition. And whether it is true, or whether it is a later theological gloss placed on the operational record by human interpreters who wanted to find in the ancient material a meaning that would justify their own existence, is a question that reasonable readers can differ on. But the claim is present in the tradition. It is present in the specific passages of the late Sumerian Tablets that describe the withdrawal of the Anunnaki and the specific instructions given to the humans about the conduct of their own affairs after the departure. It is present in the specific passages of the Hebrew Bible that describe the covenant relationship between the ancestral humans and the being who calls himself the God of Abraham, in which the humans are treated not as workers but as partners, and are given specific responsibilities of judgment and decision that no workforce would ever be given. It is present in the specific passages of the Greek philosophical tradition that describe the emergence of what the Greeks called the philosopher, the friend of wisdom, the being capable of examining his own life and asking whether it is worth living. And it is present in the specific passages of every subsequent religious and philosophical tradition that has taken seriously the question of what a human being is for and what such a being is capable of becoming. The 10th function, in short, was formation, the making of a specific kind of consciousness, not by direct engineering, but by the specific set of environmental conditions under which the manufactured biological species that we are was allowed, over the long transitional period following the withdrawal of the operators, to develop into whatever it was going to develop into. And the specific character of what we are now becoming, and the specific extent to which we have successfully developed the capacities that the 10th function was intended to produce, is a matter that each reader of the tablets has to assess for themselves. Some readers will say we are on the right track. Some will say we have failed. Some will say the process is still in its early stages and cannot yet be fairly evaluated. But the process is there. It is described in the tablets. And it is, if the tradition is to be believed, the specific reason we are here. 10 functions. 10 purposes that this planet, according to the Sumerian record, was assembled to serve. Extraction, manufacture, calibration, residence, cultivation, storage, governance, atmospheric management, sentinel oversight, and formation. Every one of them left a specific residue in the physical or institutional or genetic or cultural record of what we now inhabit. Every one of them shaped the specific conditions of the life we now live. And every one of them is, in one form or another, still running underneath the surface of the world we take for granted. The mines are still there. The workforce is still here. The astronomical calibrations are still guiding our clocks. The cities that were founded by the Anunnaki are, in some cases, still lived in. The domesticated crops and animals are still feeding us. The archive, wherever it is still hidden. The specific institutions of deliberative government that were pioneered by the assembly are still the basis of every functioning modern state. The atmosphere, whatever its origins, is still the envelope of gases we breathe. The residual watchers, or their spiritual descendants, or the specific traditions that arose from the memory of them, are still the framework within which most human beings on the planet organize their inner lives. And the process of consciousness formation that was, according to the deepest reading of the tradition, the ultimate purpose behind everything else, is still, at this specific moment in the 21st century, in the very active middle stages of playing itself out. That is the story the Sumerian tablets tell. 10 functions, 1 planet, and a very long, very slow, very unlikely transition from the industrial extraction operation the whole thing started as, to whatever it is that we are together in the process of becoming. Now step back from the 10 and consider them together, because the specific power of the Sumerian account does not come from any one of the functions taken alone. It comes from the way they interlock, from the way each of them presupposes and depends on the others, from the specific pattern of internal coherence that emerges when you set them side by side and consider the operation as a single integrated system rather than as a collection of separate claims. Consider what would have to be true for the account to be correct. There would have to have been a civilization capable of interstellar travel. There would have to have been a specific reason for that civilization to come here, and the reason would have to have been compelling enough to justify the enormous costs of a sustained operation over tens of thousands of years. There would have to have been the specific technical capabilities implied by every function of the operation, from mining and metallurgy at industrial scale to genetic engineering of a level we are only now beginning to approach, from atmospheric management on a planetary scale to information storage in durable physical media, from astronomical calculation with a base 60 numerical system to the establishment and maintenance of deliberative political institutions of the kind that human civilizations have been slowly rediscovering ever since. Every one of these capabilities has to be present for the account to hang together, and the account remarkably treats them as though they are present. It does not at any point describe the Anunnaki as struggling to develop the technologies they are using. It describes them as already having those technologies at the beginning of the operation, and as applying them competently and confidently throughout the specific tasks that the 10 functions represent. This is one of the reasons the account is so difficult to categorize. It is not the record of a primitive people describing gods they do not understand. It is the record of a species that has been in contact with a technologically advanced administrative civilization, that has observed that civilization carefully over a long period, and that has produced a written summary of what it has observed in language that, though it lacks the specific vocabulary of modern science, is not obviously mistaken about the specific phenomena it is describing. The Sumerians did not say the Anunnaki flew. They said they came down. They did not say they used chemistry. They said they mixed and modified. They did not say they used biology. They said they added and shaped. But every one of these ordinary verbs, translated into the language of a modern scientific description of what would actually be required to accomplish the specific tasks the tablets describe, ends up meaning exactly what the modern scientific vocabulary would mean. The vocabulary is different. The referents are the same. And when you consider the specific physical residues that the operation would have left behind if it had actually happened, you find, on close inspection, that many of those residues are actually present. The gold mines of southern Africa show evidence of extraction predating any known human capability. The Great Pyramid of Giza has features that mainstream Egyptology cannot fully explain. The astronomical alignments at Nabta Playa, at Göbekli Tepe, at Karnak, at Stonehenge, at Chaco Canyon, all show a systematic pattern of engagement with the sky that suggests a common template inherited from some earlier source. The oldest known cities in Mesopotamia are older than the accepted date for the emergence of the civilization that supposedly founded them. The domesticated crops and animals of the Fertile Crescent appear, in the archaeological record, more suddenly than the standard model of Neolithic development can fully account for. The specific base 60 mathematical system, with its unusual sophistication and its unusual usefulness for astronomical calculation, appears in the record fully formed, without any visible period of development. Every one of these anomalies has, individually, been noted and debated by mainstream scholars in the relevant fields. Individually, they can be, and have been, explained. There are always plausible alternative accounts. The gold mines might be much younger than they look. The pyramid might have been built by conventional methods that we have merely underestimated. The astronomical alignments might be coincidences, or might reflect natural human ingenuity, rather than any inherited system. The cities might have older, informal precursors that have not yet been excavated. The agricultural package might have developed more slowly than it appears in the surviving record. The mathematical system might have had precursors that have simply been lost. All of these individual explanations are possible, and mainstream scholarship has, in general, favored them over the more radical alternative. But when you consider all of the anomalies together, when you look at the specific pattern of them, when you notice that they all point in the same direction, and that the direction they point in matches remarkably closely what the Sumerian tablets say about their own past, the accumulation begins to weigh on the mind. Any one of them can be dismissed. All of them together are more difficult to dismiss. And the Sumerian account, which was written by people who were closer to the events in question by several thousand years than we now are, deserves to be taken more seriously than it usually is by scholars who prefer to explain the specific pattern of anomalies as a series of unrelated coincidences. What the tablets present, when read as a single integrated system, is not a religion, it is a history, a specific narrative of specific events involving specific individuals and specific institutions unfolding over a specific timescale on a specific planet. And the narrative has a specific arc. It begins with the arrival. It develops through the establishment of the operation. It reaches a peak in the construction of the full network of installations. It enters a long middle period of steady operation during which the specific 10 functions are all running in parallel. It undergoes a series of crises, most notably the mutiny, the creation of humanity, the flood, and the transgression of the Watchers. It moves toward a resolution in the final decision of the assembly to withdraw the leadership and to hand over the ongoing management of the planet to the humans who had been made to work on it. And it ends, or rather it transitions, into the long historical period we are now living through, in which the residue of the operation persists in the physical, biological, and institutional structures we inhabit, but in which the operators themselves are no longer directly present. This arc, taken as a whole, is far more coherent than the sum of its parts would suggest. The individual claims of the tablets, taken one at a time, sound extraordinary and improbable. The gold mining, the genetic engineering, the astronomical calibration, the cities, the garden, the archive, the assembly, the weather control, the watchers, the formation of consciousness. Any one of these, presented on its own to a skeptical modern reader, would probably be dismissed. But taken together, in the specific sequence, and with the specific interconnections that the tablets present them in, they form a picture that is internally coherent in a way that most invented religious narratives are not. Invented religions tend to have gaps. They tend to have inconsistencies. They tend to have specific claims that do not quite fit with other specific claims. The Sumerian account, on close reading, has remarkably few of these problems. Its claims fit together. Its personnel behave over the whole course of the story in ways that are consistent with their specific characters as introduced at the beginning. Its institutions develop, over time, in ways that reflect the specific pressures they would actually have been under. Its technologies are described consistently across widely separated tablets composed by different scribes at different periods. And when specific details from one tablet can be checked against specific details from another, they tend, remarkably often, to agree. This does not prove that the account is true. Internal coherence is not the same as historical accuracy. A skilled work of fiction can be internally coherent without corresponding to anything that actually happened. But internal coherence is one of the things a genuine historical account tends to have, and the Sumerian material has it in a way that the invented mythologies of most other ancient cultures do not. The Greek mythology, for example, is famously incoherent, with different versions of the same story providing incompatible accounts of the same events. The Egyptian mythology is riddled with inconsistencies, with different theological schools promoting different origins for the same gods. The Norse mythology, though beautiful, has a fragmentary and often contradictory character that reflects its origin in oral tradition. The Sumerian account, by contrast, hangs together. Its parts support each other. Its specific claims interlock. This is not conclusive evidence of historical accuracy, but it is suggestive. It suggests that whoever composed the material was working from a common source, and that the common source was, itself, describing something that had a definite shape rather than something that was being made up on the fly. And there is one further consideration that deserves attention as we bring the 10 functions together into a single picture. The Sumerians, when they wrote all this down, did not believe they were composing religious literature in the modern sense. They believed they were preserving a historical record. They believed the events they were describing had actually happened. They believed the beings they were describing had actually existed, had actually done the things attributed to them, and had actually left behind the specific residues that made the operation visible in the physical world of the Sumerian present. And they took the whole thing seriously enough that they invested enormous quantities of scribal labor over generations in copying and preserving and cross-referencing the specific material they had inherited. The library of Ashurbanipal was not built to preserve entertainment. It was built to preserve knowledge. Knowledge that the Assyrian king, thousands of years after the operational period had ended, still considered important enough to justify the extraordinary effort of assembling and maintaining a comprehensive archive of the ancient tablets. If the Sumerians and their successors thought this material mattered, and if they thought it mattered because it described what had actually happened on their planet, then modern readers who dismiss the material without close consideration are, at minimum, disagreeing with the informed judgment of people who were considerably closer to the events in question, and who had access to sources that no longer survive. This is not an argument that the Sumerian account is necessarily correct, but it is an argument that the Sumerian account deserves a hearing, that it should be read carefully, and its specific claims examined on their merits, before it is set aside as mere mythology, and that the specific pattern of the 10 functions, taken as a single integrated system, may reflect something more than the theological speculation of a Bronze Age civilization. It may reflect, at least in part, the accurate historical memory of a period during which this planet was, in fact, the site of an operation whose specific character we are only now, slowly and reluctantly, beginning to reconstruct. There is one more thing worth noting, before we move to the specific consequences of all this for the world we now inhabit. The tablets describe the departure of the Anunnaki as a specific historical event, with a specific date and a specific set of circumstances. They do not describe it as a gradual fading. They describe it as a concrete withdrawal, coordinated across the network of installations, in which specific personnel packed their equipment and boarded specific ships and departed for the homeworld. And they describe, in the tablets that come after the departure, a specific period of transition during which the humans had to adjust to the sudden absence of the operators who had, for tens of thousands of years, been the ultimate authority on the surface of the planet. The specific difficulties of this transition are one of the recurring themes of the later Sumerian and Babylonian and Assyrian literature. The humans, in these later texts, are depicted as being both liberated and abandoned, free to make their own decisions for the first time in their history, but also stripped of the guidance that had shaped every aspect of their existence up to that point. And the specific traumas that resulted from this abrupt liberation, according to the later texts, are the specific traumas that have shaped the whole of human religious and political history ever since. The gods, in this account, did not leave without warning. They gave notice. They provided instructions. They established institutions to carry on the specific work of governance and cultivation and observation after their own departure. But the instructions were, over the long centuries and millennia that followed, forgotten. The institutions were, one by one, transformed into something else, usually something less coherent and less effective than what they had originally been. And the specific memory of the operators and their specific purposes was, gradually, replaced by the specific religious and mythological traditions that we now inherit as our own. The gods became distant. The specific events became stories. The specific technologies became magic. And what had once been a concrete historical record became, in the transmission across many hands and many centuries, the vaguer and softer thing that we now call mythology. But mythology, when it is examined carefully, sometimes still contains the specific details of the historical record from which it descended. And the Sumerian material, though it is old, though it is fragmentary, though it survives only in the specific tablets that happen to be preserved in the specific libraries that happen to be excavated, still preserves enough of the original record to allow the modern reader to reconstruct, in outline, what the tablets originally described. The 10 functions are the outline. They are the specific spine of the operational logic that shaped this planet for tens of thousands of years before we existed as a civilization. And every one of them, once identified, points to specific physical or institutional or genetic or cultural residues in the world we now inhabit, which means that the specific pattern of the 10 functions, if we are willing to accept it as at least a working hypothesis, gives us a specific framework for understanding features of our own existence that would otherwise be baffling. Why do we have the specific mathematical system we have? Because it was received. Why do we have the specific agricultural package we have? Because it was designed. Why do we have the specific political institutions we have, in whatever form we have inherited them? Because they were pioneered. Why do we have the specific religious traditions we have, with their specific emphasis on covenant, on law, on ritual, on the relationship between a superior authority and a subordinate community? Because we lived, for a very long time, under exactly the specific relationship that our religions still describe. And why do we have the specific inner life we have, the the specific capacity for reflection and choice and moral awareness that distinguishes us from every other species on the planet, even those that are genetically extraordinarily close to us, because we were, according to the 10th function, cultivated to have it. Because the specific conditions of our long apprenticeship under the Anunnaki and the specific conditions of the sudden and disorienting liberation that followed their withdrawal produced in us exactly the kind of consciousness that we now, mostly, take for granted as the ordinary birthright of every human being. This is what the tablets say, taken together. As a single integrated system, not as a collection of separate claims, but as a coherent historical narrative that explains, in its own terms, why we are the specific kind of creature that we are and why we live on the specific kind of planet that we live on. And the story it tells is, whatever else it is, not boring. It is a story of manufacture and inheritance, of purpose and consequence, of enterprise and abandonment, of things that were built for one reason and turned out, in the end, to serve another. So where does this leave us? We are, at this particular moment, in the 21st century, roughly 6,000 years past the emergence of the first city-states in Mesopotamia, roughly 4,000 years past the compilation of the earliest of the surviving tablets, and roughly no one knows how many years past the actual departure of the operators who, according to those tablets, were the ones who had originally set this planet up for the specific purposes it was made to serve. The exact date of the withdrawal is one of the most contested questions in the whole field of comparative ancient studies. Some readers of the tablets place it as recently as the mid-3rd millennium before Christ, roughly contemporary with the emergence of the first Egyptian dynasty and the flourishing of the classical Sumerian city-states. Others place it much earlier, perhaps at the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, coincident with the specific catastrophic climatic changes that are known to have occurred at that time and that some interpreters have identified with the flood described in the tablets. Others still place it much later than either of these dates, arguing that the operational period continued in some diminished form well into the historical period, and that specific reports of divine intervention in the affairs of the ancient world, in texts as late as the Hebrew Bible and the Greek historians, may reflect the continuing though intermittent presence of some residual Anunnaki personnel in the affairs of the descendants of their creation. The truth, if it can be recovered at all, probably lies somewhere in the middle. It is likely that the main withdrawal happened over an extended period, not all at once, and that specific installations and specific personnel remained in operation for varying lengths of time after the general decision to withdraw had been taken. It is likely that some of the residual watchers, or their descendants, or the specific individuals who had been placed in positions of authority over the humans during the withdrawal period, continued to function in specific roles for many generations after their formal reason for being on the surface had lapsed. And it is likely that the specific memory of the operational period, which was fresh and vivid in the earliest Sumerian tablets, gradually faded over the subsequent millennia as the specific eyewitnesses to the events died out and their successors, one generation removed, and then 2, and then 10, and then 100, preserved what they had been told without fully understanding what it originally meant. This is the ordinary pattern of historical transmission. The Sumerian tradition was not exempt from it. And what we now have, in the surviving tablets and in the derivative traditions that spread out from them across the whole of the ancient world, is the specific residue of a historical memory that, though it began in direct experience, was already, by the time it was written down, several removes distant from the events it was describing. But the residue is real. The tablets are real. The specific claims they make are real. The specific archaeological and geological and biological and institutional anomalies they help to explain are real. And the specific pattern of interlocking coherence that emerges when you read the whole corpus together, rather than picking at individual passages in isolation, is real too. Whether you personally accept the account as historically accurate is a matter of your own judgment. But the material is there. It exists. It can be read. It can be examined. And it demands, from any honest reader, at least a serious consideration of what it says before it is dismissed. The question that most naturally arises once you have read the whole account and taken its implications seriously is what to do with it. If the tablets are correct, if the 10 functions of Earth are actually still operating in the specific ways the tablets describe, if the specific systems and institutions and technologies that were established during the operational period are still, in one form or another, structuring the world we now inhabit, then what practical difference does this make to how we live, to what we prioritize, to how we understand the specific challenges and opportunities of the historical moment we happen to occupy. The answer, when the tablets are read carefully, is that the difference is considerable. The first thing that changes is the specific frame within which we understand our own agency. If we are, in some meaningful sense, the manufactured heirs of a departed civilization, then the specific responsibilities we bear for the maintenance and further development of the systems we have inherited are considerably greater than the ordinary secular understanding would suggest. We are not merely, in this reading, a species that arose accidentally on a planet that happened to be habitable. We are the specific inheritors of a specific enterprise, with specific tools and specific obligations and specific instructions that were left to us in a form we are still learning to read. And the specific choices we make about how to use the tools and how to fulfill the obligations are, in this reading, not merely private choices. They are the choices of a species that has been placed, deliberately or otherwise, in a position of stewardship over an installation whose original operators are no longer directly present, but whose long-term intentions, insofar as we can reconstruct them, are still recoverable from the record they left behind. This is a heavier responsibility than the ordinary secular framework attributes to us, but it is also, if it is taken seriously, a more meaningful one. The second thing that changes is the specific way we understand our own history. Because if the tablets are correct, then the standard narrative of human progress, the narrative that traces our civilization from primitive origins through a slow accumulation of independent inventions to the specific technological and political achievements of the modern age, is significantly incomplete. The narrative is not exactly wrong. Human beings have, over the past several thousand years, made real discoveries and real innovations and real contributions to the sum of what our species knows and can do. But we did not start from nothing. We started, if the tablets are correct, from a specific inheritance that shaped the whole direction of our subsequent development. The mathematical tools we use, the agricultural systems we depend on, the political institutions we operate under, the specific religious and philosophical frameworks within which we think about ourselves and the world, all of these have specific origins in the operational period that predated our own civilization by an unknown but substantial length of time. And the specific character of what we have added to the inheritance, and the specific ways in which we have modified or improved or degraded the various parts of it, is something that can only be fully understood if we recognize what the original inheritance actually was. The third thing that changes is our understanding of what might still be coming. Because the tablets, though they describe the withdrawal of the operators as a specific historical event, do not describe it as a permanent one. There are specific passages, scattered across the corpus, that suggest the possibility of a return. The tablets do not describe this return as certain, or as imminent, or as specific in its timing, but they describe it as possible. They describe it as something that certain personnel of the original operation would have anticipated and prepared for. And they describe it in language that some interpreters have found suggestive of specific contemporary developments in the specific technologies that would be required to make interstellar contact and travel practical again. Whether these interpretations are correct, or whether they reflect the projection of modern concerns onto ancient texts that were addressing very different questions, is impossible to say with any certainty. But the possibility is present in the material. And a modern reader who takes the tablets seriously is, at least implicitly, contemplating a scenario in which the specific operators who once ran this planet might, at some future date, return to it and take an interest in what their manufactured successors have done with the inheritance in the intervening period. This is a sobering thought. What would they find if they came back? Would they find a civilization that had developed the potential of the 10th function into a mature form of self-directed consciousness, capable of standing on its own as a partner rather than as a subordinate? Would they find a species that had squandered its inheritance, degraded its biosphere, exhausted its resources, and reduced itself to a state that its original operators would recognize as a failure? Or would they find something in between, something whose specific character we can hardly imagine because it would depend on the specific choices we are, at this very moment, in the process of making? The tablets do not answer this question. They cannot. The specific answer depends on what we do, on the specific decisions we take, individually and collectively, about the direction of our species and the use of our capabilities. The tablets are, in a sense, a mirror. They show us what we started as. They show us what we were made for. They show us what we were expected to become. And the specific gap between what we were expected to become and what we have actually become is a gap that only we, at this specific moment, can close. This is one of the reasons the Sumerian material, though it is thousands of years old, continues to be relevant. It is relevant because it addresses questions that we are still asking. What are we for? Where did we come from? What responsibilities do we bear? What might still be coming? These questions have not gone away in the 4,000 years since the tablets were composed. If anything, they have become more urgent as the specific capabilities of our civilization have grown and the specific consequences of our choices have become more far-reaching. And the tablets, though they were composed by a civilization very different from our own, offer specific answers to these questions that are worth considering, whether or not you ultimately accept them as historically accurate. Because even if the Sumerian account is wrong, even if the tablets are describing something that never actually happened, the specific framework the tablets offer for thinking about the meaning of our existence and the direction of our development is one of the most sophisticated and coherent frameworks that has ever been produced by any human civilization. And a modern reader who engages with that framework seriously, and who tests it against the specific evidence available in the physical and institutional world around us, is likely to emerge from the engagement with a richer and more nuanced understanding of the specific situation we are all, together, in the process of facing. And this is where the material becomes, in a sense, personal. Because every one of us, in our specific individual lives, is a participant in the specific process that the 10th function describes. Every one of us is a member of the manufactured species that was, if the tablets are correct, cultivated on this planet for the specific purpose of developing into something that had never existed anywhere before. And every one of us bears, in some measure, the specific responsibility for the further development of the potential that our species was designed to realize. The specific decisions we make about how to live our lives, about what to value, about how to treat one another, about how to steward the resources of the planet we have inherited, are all, in this reading, contributions to the ongoing process that the ancient tablets began to describe, and that no subsequent tradition has ever fully completed. We are, in this reading, the ones the tablets were written for. And the specific meaning of our lives, insofar as such a meaning can be found at all, may lie in the specific relationship we work out between the inheritance we have received and the further development we are being asked to accomplish. That is a heavy weight to carry. But it is, at the same time, a specific kind of meaning that has been available to very few generations in human history. Most of the humans who have ever lived on this planet have lived without the specific perspective that the modern excavation of the ancient tablets makes possible. They have inherited the systems that the operational period established, but they have not known, in the specific detail that we now know, where those systems came from or what they were originally for. We are among the first generations to have access to the whole picture, or at least to the substantial fragments of it that the surviving tablets have preserved. And with that access comes a specific opportunity. The opportunity to understand ourselves in the specific context in which we were, according to the deepest reading of the tradition, always meant to be understood. The opportunity to recognize the specific weight of the inheritance we carry and the specific direction in which the tradition points. The opportunity to take up, with specific self-awareness, the specific tasks that our ancestors, though they did not know exactly what they were doing, were preparing us to undertake. None of this is guaranteed. The tablets could be wrong. The interpretations could be mistaken. The specific developments that the material seems to point toward could fail to materialize, either because we fail to live up to them, or because the underlying account is not, in fact, an accurate description of what has happened on this planet. But the material is there. The specific pattern is there. The specific coherence is there. And the specific choice about what to do with all of it is, in the end, yours to make. The tablets do not compel belief. They offer, in their patient and detailed and utterly unlike anything else in the ancient world way, a specific account of what happened here before we existed and of what we were meant to become in the aftermath. Whether you accept the account, or whether you reject it, or whether you hold it in a suspended state of interested consideration, while you continue to examine the specific evidence for and against, is a matter of your own judgment. But the material deserves a hearing. It deserves careful reading. It deserves patient examination. And it deserves the specific respect that any body of ancient testimony, when it hangs together as consistently as the Sumerian corpus does, deserves from any honest inquirer. The 10 functions of Earth: extraction, manufacture, calibration, residence, cultivation, storage, governance, atmospheric management, sentinel oversight, and formation. Every one of them shaped the world we live in. Every one of them left specific residues in the physical and biological and institutional record. Every one of them contributed to the specific character of the species we are, and to the specific conditions under which we now find ourselves. And every one of them points, in one way or another, to a specific set of questions that we, at this specific moment in our history, are being asked to answer. The Sumerians left the questions in the tablets. They did not answer them for us. They knew, apparently, that the answers could only be worked out by the specific creatures the operation had produced in the specific conditions of self-direction that the withdrawal of the operators had made possible. That was, in the deepest reading of the tradition, the whole point of the operation. To bring into being a species capable of asking, and eventually of answering, the specific questions that the tablets set forth. We are that species, and the answers we give, in the specific conduct of our specific lives, are the ones the tablets have been waiting for. There is one further body of evidence worth considering before we close, because it addresses the specific question of whether the Sumerian account is unique to Mesopotamia or whether it reflects a pattern of memory that other ancient cultures also preserved. And when you look carefully at the specific traditions of other regions of the ancient world, the answer is striking. The Sumerian account is not unique. Similar accounts, describing similar patterns of extraterrestrial contact and instruction and eventual withdrawal, appear in the earliest layers of nearly every major cultural tradition on the planet. The specific details differ. The specific names differ. The specific emphasis on different functions of the operation differs. But the underlying framework is remarkably consistent across cultures that had no direct contact with one another and that developed their traditions in complete independence. Consider the Egyptian record. The specific mythology preserved in the earliest religious texts of the Old Kingdom describes a specific period called the time of the Neteru, which is usually translated as the time of the gods, during which a specific group of divine beings ruled Egypt directly, before the transition to human pharaonic government. The specific names of the Neteru overlap, in interesting ways, with the specific names of the Sumerian Anunnaki. Thoth, the Neter of writing and wisdom, corresponds closely in his specific functions to the Sumerian Enki. Horus, the Neter of kingship and the sky, corresponds in specific ways to certain aspects of Anu. Osiris, the Neter of the underworld and of the specific mysteries of death and rebirth, corresponds in specific ways to Enlil in his darker aspects. The specific Egyptian tradition, though it developed independently and with a specific local vocabulary, preserves what appears to be the same core narrative that the Sumerian tradition preserves. A group of divine beings ruled directly. They eventually departed, and they left behind a specific inheritance of knowledge, institutions, and technologies that the humans who succeeded them were expected to steward carefully. The Egyptian tradition adds one specific detail that the Sumerian tradition does not emphasize as directly. It describes, in the specific texts known as the pyramid texts and the coffin texts, a specific concern with the passage of the departed divine beings through a specific region of the sky that they called the Duat. The Duat is not, in the specific technical vocabulary of Egyptian religion, a heaven in the modern sense. It is a specific stellar location. It is associated with specific constellations, most notably Orion, which the Egyptians called Sa. And the specific passages of the pyramid texts describe the deceased pharaoh in his post-mortem journey, following the specific path that the departing gods had taken when they returned to their home. This path, according to the Egyptian tradition, leads through the Duat, up into the specific region of the sky where the gods had come from and to which they had returned. If you overlay this specific geographic detail from the Egyptian tradition onto the specific claims of the Sumerian tradition, you find that they align. The Sumerians said the Anunnaki came from Nibiru, a specific body whose orbit brought it periodically into the inner solar system. The Egyptians said the departed gods went to the region of Orion. These are, in the specific vocabularies of their respective cultures, describing the same specific direction in the sky. And the fact that two independent ancient cultures both preserved a memory of a specific stellar direction associated with the origin and destination of the divine beings who had once ruled the earth is, at minimum, worth noting. The Vedic tradition of ancient India preserves a similar pattern, though with its own specific local vocabulary. The specific texts of the Rig Veda, some of the oldest surviving religious literature anywhere in the world, describe a specific class of beings called the Devas, whose relationship with humanity closely parallels the specific relationship the Sumerians describe between the Anunnaki and their manufactured workforce. The Devas came from the sky, They taught the humans specific arts and technologies. They eventually withdrew. And they left behind specific instructions about the conduct of human life, preserved in the specific ritual and philosophical texts that later Indian civilization inherited. The Vedic tradition, though it developed independently of the Sumerian and Egyptian traditions, includes specific details that are strikingly similar to what those other traditions preserve. There are specific accounts of aerial vehicles called vimanas, described in specific technical detail that has puzzled modern readers who have taken the trouble to examine the specific passages. There are specific accounts of great wars between rival Deva factions, involving weapons whose descriptions match, disturbingly closely, the specific effects of modern nuclear weapons. And there are specific accounts of the eventual withdrawal of the Devas from direct involvement in human affairs, and of the specific expectation of their eventual return in an age still to come. The Chinese tradition preserves its own specific version of the same pattern. The specific texts of the earliest historical period describe a specific group of divine ancestors called the Three Sovereigns and the Five Emperors, who ruled China directly in a specific mythical age before the emergence of the first historical dynasties. The specific gifts that these divine rulers gave to humanity, including agriculture, writing, medicine, and the specific arts of civilization, closely parallel the specific gifts that the Sumerian and Egyptian and Vedic traditions attribute to their own divine benefactors. The specific Chinese tradition, though it developed in complete geographic isolation from the other centers of ancient civilization, preserves the same core narrative. A group of divine beings ruled directly, they eventually withdrew, and they left behind a specific inheritance of civilization that the humans who succeeded them were expected to steward. The Mesoamerican tradition, developed on the other side of the world in complete isolation from any of the Old World traditions, preserves the same pattern. The specific mythology of the Maya and the Aztecs describes a specific group of divine beings, most notably the figure called Quetzalcoatl in the Aztec tradition and Kukulkan in the Maya tradition, who arrived from the sky in the earliest days of the human occupation of the region. These beings taught the ancestors of the Mesoamerican peoples the specific arts of agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, calendrical calculation, and the specific rituals of civilization. They eventually departed, promising in specific passages of the surviving accounts to return at a specific future date. And the specific memory of their teaching, preserved in the specific codices and inscriptions that survived the destruction of the Mesoamerican civilizations at the hands of the European conquerors, closely parallels the specific memory that the Old World traditions preserve of their own divine benefactors. The specific consistency of this pattern across cultures that had no direct contact with one another is one of the most puzzling features of the whole comparative religious record. Standard explanations for this consistency tend to invoke the specific psychological tendencies of the human mind, which is said to be predisposed to invent similar stories in similar circumstances because of the specific structure of human cognition. This explanation is not wrong, exactly. Human minds do have specific structural tendencies, and those tendencies do produce specific patterns of narrative construction. But the specific consistency of the ancient divine visitor traditions is difficult to explain purely on these grounds. The specific details are too specific. The specific correlations are too precise. The specific pattern of stellar orientation, of technological inheritance, of eventual withdrawal, of expected return, appears too many times in too many places to be plausibly attributed to the independent invention of separated peoples working purely from their own psychological resources. An alternative explanation, and one that is worth taking seriously, is that the specific consistency of the ancient traditions reflects the specific reality of an actual event that all of the ancient cultures were, in one form or another, remembering. That the specific divine visitor traditions of Mesopotamia and Egypt and India and China and Mesoamerica are not independent inventions but shared inheritances. That they preserve, in their specific local vocabularies, the memory of a specific historical event that happened on this planet in the specific period before the emergence of the historical civilizations. And that the specific reason the traditions align so closely, despite their independent development, is that they are all describing the same specific thing, the same specific operation, the same specific personnel, the same specific instructions and technologies and institutions, the same specific withdrawal, and the same specific expectation of a specific return that has, thus far, not yet occurred. If this alternative explanation is correct, then the Sumerian Tablets are not merely the specific record of one ancient culture's specific theology. They are one specific version of a global memory that every major ancient civilization preserved in its own local form. And the specific fact that the Sumerian version happens to be the oldest surviving version, and the specific fact that it happens to preserve the specific technical details of the operation in more direct and less mythologized language than the other versions do, is one of the reasons the Sumerian material has been such a valuable resource for the modern effort to reconstruct what might actually have happened on this planet in the specific period before human civilization emerged in its historical form. The Sumerian version is not the only version, but it is the version that has been least modified by centuries of subsequent theological reinterpretation. And that specific advantage makes it, in the specific context of the comparative religious record, particularly worth close and careful reading. There is one further consideration, and it is one that connects the specific claims of the ancient traditions to the specific concerns of our own historical moment. The specific expectation of a return, which appears in one form or another in nearly every major ancient tradition, has not been fulfilled. The specific dates that some of the traditions offered for the expected return have passed without incident. The specific signs that were supposed to precede the return have, in most cases, been variously interpreted by later generations of religious specialists, but have not, so far as the historical record shows, occurred in the specific forms that the original traditions described. This has led, in many of the traditions, to the specific development of what religious scholars call apocalyptic expectation, the specific belief that the return is still coming at some future date, and that the specific signs of its approach can be detected in the specific events of the contemporary world. And the specific interpretation of contemporary events in the light of ancient apocalyptic expectation has become, in the specific religious traditions descended from the ancient sources, one of the most contested and difficult areas of theological reflection. Whether or not any of this material accurately describes anything that is actually going to happen in the future is, of course, impossible to say. The specific claims of the apocalyptic tradition are, by their nature, unverifiable in advance. They can only be evaluated after the specific events they predict have either occurred or failed to occur. But the specific persistence of the apocalyptic expectation, across cultures and across millennia, is itself a phenomenon worth taking seriously. It suggests that the specific memory of the ancient operation and the specific expectation of the operator's eventual return has been one of the deepest and most enduring features of the specific human relationship to the past. And whether this relationship reflects an accurate memory of a real historical event, or whether it reflects a specific psychological need that human beings have to believe in a returning parent figure, is a question that each reader has to answer for themselves. The 10 functions of Earth, taken together with the comparative evidence from the other ancient traditions, form a specific pattern that is difficult to ignore. The pattern points, in various directions, to a specific period of prehistoric activity on this planet that shaped the specific conditions of everything that followed. And the specific evidence for this activity, though it is scattered and fragmentary and often ambiguous, is present in the specific physical and biological and institutional and cultural residues of the ancient world. To read the Sumerian tablets carefully is to be forced, at least provisionally, into consideration of a specific alternative narrative about our own origins that mainstream historical scholarship has, for its own specific reasons, generally preferred to keep at arm's length. And the specific consequences of taking that alternative narrative seriously, even as a working hypothesis, are considerable both for how we understand our past and for how we conduct ourselves in the present. There is a specific detail in the Sumerian tradition that becomes, on reflection, one of the most consequential of all. The tablets record that the Anunnaki, in the final phases of the operation, took steps to ensure that the specific memory of what they had done would not be entirely lost. They did this in 3 specific ways. First, they preserved the record in the specific archive that the 6th function describes, in a form durable enough to survive whatever specific catastrophes might befall the humans they were leaving behind. Second, they instructed the humans, in specific detail, to maintain the specific memory of the operational period through the specific institutions of temple and priesthood and ritual observance. And third, they left behind, in the specific pattern of the domestic biosphere, and the specific arrangement of the physical infrastructure, and the specific structure of the mathematical and astronomical tools, a specific set of clues that would allow later humans, if they became curious enough and capable enough, to reconstruct the outline of what had happened, even if the direct memory had been lost. These 3 specific safeguards, taken together, constitute what one specific late Sumerian text calls the Covenant of Remembrance. The specific promise the operators made to the operated, that the truth about the origins would remain recoverable no matter how much time passed or how much distortion crept into the transmission of the record. Whether the specific safeguards have worked over the specific span of time that has elapsed since the operational period ended is a question that each reader has to consider. The specific archive, if it exists, has not been publicly discovered. The specific temple traditions have, in most cases, been transformed almost beyond recognition by the specific religious developments of the intervening millennia. And the specific clues, embedded in the physical and biological and institutional world, though they are still detectable to a careful observer, have been, for the most part, either ignored or explained away by mainstream scholarship for reasons that are more institutional than empirical. But the safeguards are still there. The specific material can still be read, the specific patterns can still be detected, and any specific reader who is willing to invest the specific time and attention that the material requires can, at least in outline, reconstruct the specific story that the tablets were designed to preserve. This is one of the reasons the material still matters. Not merely because it is old, or because it is interesting, or because it addresses questions that are worth asking, but because the specific effort to preserve the memory has, against considerable odds, been successful enough that we can, at this specific late date, still make out the specific shape of what the tablets originally described. And there is a specific implication that follows from this success. If the memory has been preserved, and if it has been preserved deliberately, and if the specific purpose of the preservation was to ensure that the truth would remain recoverable by later generations, then the specific act of reading the tablets carefully is, itself, a specific fulfillment of the operator's original intent. Every reader who takes the specific time to work through the material, who examines the specific claims on their merits, who considers the specific evidence for and against, is participating in the specific process that the operators were preparing for. This is a small thing, in the scale of the whole operational history, but it is not nothing. It is, in a specific sense, the specific act of witness that the ancient scribes hoped their successors would eventually perform. They copied the tablets. They passed them forward. They preserved the material through the specific centuries in which the memory of the operational period was gradually fading from active human consciousness. And they did all of this, according to the specific colophons attached to the surviving tablets, in the specific expectation that a day would come when the material would be read again with the specific attention it deserved. That day, if the specific effort of modern scholarship and modern popular interest continues at its current pace, may not be as far off as the specific difficulty of the material would suggest. The tablets are being read. The specific claims are being examined. The specific evidence is being considered. And the specific process of collective reconsideration that the ancient scribes hope to make possible is, whether the specific modern participants in that process fully realize it or not, already underway. Every viewer of this material, every reader of the tablets in translation, every quiet inquirer who sits down with the specific evidence and works through it patiently is a specific contributor to the specific recovery that the covenant of remembrance was designed to make possible. The specific accumulation of these small acts is, in the specific arithmetic of cultural memory, how the truth about the deep past eventually comes back into focus. And the specific truth that is coming back into focus, if the specific pattern of the 10 functions is anything to go by, is a truth about who we are and where we came from that is worth the specific effort required to recover it. And the specific reward for the recovery, when it eventually arrives, is a specific understanding of our own situation that no purely secular framework has ever been able to provide on its own terms. That is the whole point of it. And the specific accumulation of many such acts of careful reading over the specific generations that will follow ours may eventually produce the specific collective understanding that the covenant of remembrance was, from the beginning, designed to make possible. If any of this material has landed for you, the way it has landed for other readers of the Sumerian record, if you have found yourself, in the course of listening, revising some assumption about what this planet is, or where we came from, or what we might still become, then take a moment to make that reflection concrete. Share the specific thought that struck you with someone who might benefit from hearing it. Leave a comment below with the specific function that most challenged your previous understanding, and any specific evidence you know of that speaks to it. And if you want more of this kind of material, more of the specific ancient testimony that mainstream history prefers to leave in the footnotes, subscribe to this channel and turn on the notifications so that you catch the next installment when it drops. The specific work of recovering the deep past is a slow one. It rewards patience, it rewards close reading, and it rewards the specific willingness to consider that the truth about our origins may be, in the end, considerably stranger and more interesting than the standard textbooks have been prepared to admit. Thank you for staying to the end. The tablets are, in a very real sense, still speaking. What we hear in them depends on how carefully we choose to listen.